Forward to the second edition on in retrospect. As it stands, this book did not strictly speaking offer a new interpretation of Marxism. The following quotation from Lenin would have made an appropriate epigraph. The whole point, however, is that Marx did not confine himself to economic theory in the ordinary sense of the term that, while explaining the structure and the development of the given formation of society exclusively through production relations, he clothed the skeleton in flesh and blood. The reason capital has enjoyed such tremendous success is that this book by a German economist showed the whole capitalist social formation to the reader as a living thing, with its everyday aspects. 2. In this very important text, Lenin shows that Marx created scientific sociology. He expressed similar ideas in many other places in his writings. In his Capital, Marx first analyzes the simplest, most ordinary, fundamental, most common and everyday relation of bourgeois commodity society, a relation encountered billions of times, viz., the exchange of commodities. In this very simple phenomenon, analysis reveals all the contradictions, or the germs of all the contradictions, of modern society. 3. The fact remains that the critique of everyday life was built entirely around a concept which Lenin had left aside or neglected, the concept of alienation. The fact also remains that this book developed a generally neglected aspect of Marxism, the specifically sociological aspect. When it appeared, the book was inadequately substantiated on both the philosophical and the sociological level. In the first place, it should have formulated and attempted to resolve the problem posed by the concept of alienation. It should also explain what a Marxist sociology considered as a specific science could be, as method and object, in its relation with the other sciences, political economy, history, etc., as well as with historical and dialectical materialism. The fact is, however, that 10 years ago these various problems were not sufficiently ripe. It was more, or less impossible to formulate them correctly, let alone resolve them. For today we are only just beginning to glimpse the complexity of the questions the theory of alienation poses. These questions fall into several categories. Historically, we must discover what role this concept played in the development of Marxism, how, in his early writings, Marx took it from Hegel and Feuerbach, how he transformed and redirected it, and at what date. Thus it is appropriate to follow this transformation through the texts, and this means that a rigorous examination of the early writings, and notably of the celebrated 1,844 manuscripts, is required. 5. Theoretically, we must determine what becomes of the philosophical concept of alienation in Marx's scientific and political works, notably in Capital, and understand whether the economic theory of fetishism is truly an extension of the philosophical theory of alienation onto an objective scientific level. 6. Finally, the problem philosophically is of knowing what meaning and critical or constructive importance should be given at the present moment to the concept of alienation. To what extent should a philosopher take it up again, perhaps in a modified form, and put it at the center of his thinking? This problem cannot be separated from the others, although it can be distinguished from them. If it were true, as certain Marxists argue, that Marxism as such radically rejects earlier concepts, including those which helped to develop it, so that there was an absolute caesura in human thought at the moment of Marxism's emergence. And in Marxism, at the moment when Marx became conscious of his doctrine, the problem of what the concept of alienation means now would not even arise. To take this position implies further positions, notably that Marxism is a completed system, and that philosophy's role and function are at an end. Such arguments must be deemed dogmatic and false. Such vast and difficult questions had to ripen before they could be posed. In particular, it had to be possible to ask the question, is alienation disappearing in socialist society? In the USSR or the countries which are constructing socialism, are there not contradictions indicative of new or renewed forms of economic, ideological, and political alienation? As far as sociology as a specific science is concerned, there have been many moments of uncertainty to live through. The question of whether the Stalinist interpretation of Marxism was not mutilating it and depriving it of one of its dimensions has had to be faced, as has that of whether the Marxist notion of socio-economic formation is not richer and more complex, since it involves the sociological study of social relations, than the currently favored concepts of economic base and ideological and political superstructures. The fact that these questions were absent from its argument explains to a certain extent the way the book was received when it was first published. What was the official academic response? Utter silence. At that moment in 1946, French philosophy had suffered a series of shocks from which it was only slowly recovering. The war and the occupation had killed off several important currents of thought, notably Bergsonian anti-intellectualism, compromised by a vague relationship with German irrationalism, and Leon Brunschwig's intellectualism. 3. Which was poorly equipped to resolve the new problems. The generation of Hegelians and existentialists was on the rise, but there were those who, though perfectly willing to respect and accept the notion of alienation on a speculative level, were probably less prepared to see it soiled by confrontation with actual human reality, with everyday life. 10. So the professional philosophers generally ignored the book, for, starting with its title, it entailed relinquishing the traditional image of the philosopher as master and ruler of existence, witness and judge of life from the outside, enthroned above the masses, above the moments lost in triviality, distinguished by an attitude and a distance. There is nothing really exaggerated about these metaphors. The distance is called spiritual life, and the philosopher's attitude is called contemplation, detachment, approach, 11 parenthesizing, etc. What about Marxism? The traditional philosophers, still saturated with pure speculative thought or attracted by it, gave the book a cool reception, so did the Marxists. If, in the enthusiasm of the liberation, it was hoped that soon life would be changed and the world transformed. More than that, life had already been changed. The peoples were on the move, the masses were in a ferment. Their movement was causing new surface values to rise to the what was the point of analyzing bourgeois everyday life, the style, or absence of style, imposed by the dominant class. What was the point of a philosophical or sociological critique? The weapon of criticism was about to be replaced, had already been replaced by the criticism of weapons. In France, in the rest of the world, the proletariat was no longer an oppressed class. It was imposing itself on the nations as the ruling class. To talk about alienation was no longer possible, no longer permissible. The concept was just as outdated in France as it was in the USSR, in countries where socialism was on the march, or where the rumble of revolution could already be heard. Thinking people were obsessed with the political drama, rightly so, but they were forgetting that although the political drama was being acted out or decided in the higher spheres, the state, parliament leaders, policies, it still had a base in matters relating to food, rationing, wages, the organization or reorganization of labor. A humble, everyday base. Therefore, many Marxists saw criticism of everyday life as useless and antiquated. They perceived it as a reworking of an old-fashioned, exhausted critique of bourgeois society, little more than a critique of triviality, therefore a trivial critique. For this reason, philosophers today are experiencing difficulties of a kind unknown to their predecessors. Great or small, profound or superficial, their lives have lost that simplicity and elegance of line they attribute, fictitiously no doubt, to the lives of their illustrious models. Philosophers and philosophy can no longer be isolated, disguised, hidden, and this is precisely because everyday life is the Supreme Court where wisdom, knowledge, and power are brought to judgment. 2. What has changed in the last 10 years? Under these circumstances, what is the point, after 10 years of interruption, of resuming this task? Firstly, during these years, a certain number of young intellectuals have read the book with interest, with passion. Their expressions of appreciation have alleviated any feelings of bitterness the author may have had about the coolness of the book's official reception. But that is not all. During the last 10 years, the development of research in the social sciences has shown that the book was on target, that its point of view is well-founded. Problems of everyday life and studies of everyday life have become increasingly important in the minds of historians, ethnographers, philosophers, sociologists, as well as of writers, artists, and journalists. Our very best informed and most modern publications, daily and weekly newspapers, reviews, have started columns dealing with everyday life. There has been a proliferation of books about everyday life, and bit by bit a method to confront everyday life with ideas apparently far removed from it, such as myths, ceremonies, works of art, is being developed. 12. For the historian of a specific period, for the ethnographer, for the sociologist studying a society or a group. The fundamental question would be to grasp a certain quality, difficult to define and yet essential and concrete. Something that just a quarter of an hour alone with a man from a distant or extinct culture would reveal to us. 13. Let us consider some areas very remote from the social sciences. Recently I read an article which was something of a manifesto or policy statement for the idea that the modern theater can only be a place where everyday life attains its highest degree of intensity, where the words and gestures of everyday life at last take on meaning. A Soviet critic has made the same assertion about Chekhov's theater. Chekhov considers that theater ought to represent everyday life. 15. We shall return to this idea. Again, the monumental volume of L'Encyclopédie Française devoted to everyday life was published recently. It is a considerable piece of work. 16 but one in which the descriptive and the technological points of view push the critical point of view into the background, and even obliterate it. Indisputably, the last few years have witnessed the application of the most modern of techniques to the way everyday life is organized, that is to say, to a sector which up until now has been paid scant attention. The way in which everyday life lags behind what is technically possible is and should be one of the themes of the critique of everyday life. How could this theme possibly have lost its foundation or its meaning? In L'Express of June 1956, p. 21, the following information was given on the interesting novelties which its special New York correspondent had noticed. and which will inevitably end up coming to France. Kitchens are becoming less like kitchens and more like works of art. The latest technique is the electronic oven, the intercom. A system of loudspeakers linking every room is becoming a standard piece of equipment in the home. While everyone is talking about a personalized little television network, which will enable the lady of the house to attend to her chores while keeping an eye on the children playing in another room or in the garden. The remarkable ubiquity of do-it-itself. The latest craze for the American husband includes all the household gadgets that go with it. The latest development in the household industry, swimming pools which the manufacturers say they are about to mass market. Popular requirements as let us consider some areas very remote from the social sciences. Recently I read an article which was something of a manifesto or policy statement for the idea that the modern theater can only be a place where everyday life attains its highest degree of intensity, where the words and gestures of everyday life at last take on meaning. A Soviet critic has made the same assertion about Chekhov's theater. Chekhov considers that theater ought to represent everyday life. 15. We shall return to this idea. Again, the monumental volume of L'Encyclopédie Française devoted to everyday life was published recently. It is a considerable piece of work. 16 but one in which the descriptive and the technological points of view push the critical point of view into the background and even obliterate it. Indisputably, the last few years have witnessed the application of the most modern of techniques to the way everyday life is organized, that is to say, to a sector which up until now has been paid scant attention. The way in which everyday life lags behind what is technically possible is and should be one of the themes of the critique of everyday life. How could this theme possibly have lost its foundation or its meaning? In L'Express of 8 June 1956, p. 21, the following information was given on the interesting novelties which its special New York correspondent had noticed, and which will inevitably end up coming to France. Kitchens are becoming less like kitchens and more like works of art. The latest technique is the electronic oven, the intercom. A system of loudspeakers linking every room is becoming a standard piece of equipment in the home. While everyone is talking about a personalized little television network, which will enable the lady of the house to attend to her chores while keeping an eye on the children playing in another room or in the garden. The remarkable ubiquity of do-it-itself. The latest craze for the American husband includes all the household gadgets that go with it. The latest development in the household industry, swimming pools which the manufacturers say they are about to mass market. Popular requirements as far as houses are concerned, at least 7 rooms with 2 bathrooms. In the next column, Madame Expresses informs anyone who is unaware of it that a woman needs cast iron willpower to stop her hairdresser from cutting her hair short. Nothing is more persuasive than a hairdresser who has made his mind up, and they have some powerful allies. Cover girls, actresses, all the women for whom money is no problem and whose pictures distributed every day are more persuasive than any words could be. The remarkable way in which modern techniques have penetrated everyday life has thus introduced into this backward sector the uneven development which characterizes every aspect of our manifestations era. Of the brilliant advances in the ideal home constitute sociological facts of the first importance. But they must not be allowed to conceal the contradictory character of the real social process beneath an accumulation of technological detail. These advances, along with their consequences, are provoking new structural conflicts within the concrete life of society. The same period which has witnessed breathtaking development in the application of techniques of everyday life has also witnessed the no less breathtaking degradation of everyday life for large masses of human beings. All around us, in France, in Paris itself, there are hundreds of thousands of children, youngsters, students, young couples, single people, families, living in conditions undreamed of by anyone who does not bring a sociologist's interest to bear. 17 furnished rooms, increasingly expensive and squalid, slums, overcrowded flats, attic rooms, etc. The deterioration of the conditions of existence is spreading to a great many French rural areas, notably in the southern half of the country, to a large proportion of craftsmen, small shopkeepers, and the working class. Agreed, it is not unusual to find peasants owning electric cookers, but the houses they live in are still dilapidated. They manage to buy gadgets, but cannot afford to repair their houses, and even less to modernize their farms. In other words, the latter are given up for the sake of the former. In the same way, quite a large number of working class couples have a washing machine, a television set, or a car, but they have generally sacrificed something else for these gadgets, having a baby, for example. In this way, problems of choosing what to buy or problems associated with hire purchase, etc., are posed within working class families, and these problems modify everyday life. 18. That relatively poor peasants or workers should buy television sets proves the existence of a new social need. The fact is remarkable, but it does not tell us the size or the extent of this need, nor the extent to which it is satisfied. Nor does it prove that this need has not been satisfied to the detriment of another. Far from suppressing criticism of everyday life, modern technical progress realizes it. This technicity replaces the criticism of life through dreams or ideas or poetry or those activities which rise above the everyday by the critique of everyday life from within. The critique which everyday life makes of itself, the critique of the real by the possible, and of one aspect of life by another. Compared with lower or degraded standards of living, everyday life with all the superior mod cons takes on the distance and remoteness and familiar strangeness of a dream. The display of luxury to be seen in so many films, most of them mediocre, takes on an almost fascinating character, and the spectator is uprooted from his everyday world by an everyday world other than his own. Escape into this illusory but present everyday world, the fascination of ordinary objects which scream wealth, the seductive powers of the apparently profound lives led by the men and women who move among these objects, all this explains the momentary success these films enjoy. Happily, contemporary cinema and theater have other works to offer which reveal a truth about everyday life. 2. On Charlie Chaplin, Bertolt Brecht, and some others clowning it is not Chaplin's contortions and funny faces that make people burst out laughing. From his very first films, he stood out from such other film comedians as Fatty Arbuckle and Harold Lloyd. The secret of his comic powers lies not in his body, but in the relation of this body to something else, a social relation with the material world and the social world. Naive, physically adept, but spiritually innocent, Chaplin arrives in a complicated and sophisticated universe of people and things with fixed patterns of behavior, where people behave like things, and in conjunction with things. The clown's physical suppleness and his concomitant ability to adapt himself and his gestures with an almost animal rapidity become humanized as they give way to an extreme awkwardness, which both proves and signifies his naivety. However, this awkwardness is never permanent. The original situation is reinstated. The clown has his revenge. He defeats the hostile objects and the hostile people, only to fall back into momentary disarray. Hence, visually comic moments when he cannot adapt are followed by moments of victory when he can, and this stops the mime-audience relationship from breaking down, producing fresh gusts of laughter and assuring that the humor never becomes awkward or embarrassing. Like pleasure, like harmony in music, laughter is stimulated by a series of resolved tensions, in which moments of relaxation are followed by even higher tensions. The point of departure for the vis comica peculiar to Chaplin is therefore the simplicity of a child, a primitive and a wonderfully gifted barbarian, suddenly plunged, as we all are at every moment, into an everyday life that is inflexible and bristling with ever new difficulties, some foreseeable, others not. In his first films, Chaplin takes up battle, a duel which is always different and yet always the same, with objects, everyday objects. An umbrella, a deck chair, a motorbike, a banana skin, always surprised, always delighted by the strangeness and richness of things, always awkward. When faced with ritualized practices, essential behavior, necessary conditioning, Chaplin captures our own attitude towards these trivial things, and before our very eyes. He makes it appear suddenly amazing, dramatic, and joyful. He comes as a stranger into the familiar world, he wends his way through it, not without wreaking joyful damage. Suddenly he disorientates us, but only to show us what we are when faced with objects. And these objects become suddenly alien. The familiar is no longer familiar, as for example when we arrive in a hotel room, or a furnished house, and trip over the furniture, and struggle to get the coffee grinder to work. But via this deviation through disorientation and strangeness, Chaplin reconciles us on a higher level, with ourselves, with things, and with the humanized world of things. Thus the essence of this humor is not to be found in pity, nor even in strangeness, alienation, but on the contrary in a triumph which is forever being renewed and forever threatened. The dog, the pretty girl, the child are not cinematic props, but elements necessary to the more or less complete final victory. Therefore Chaplin's first films may be seen as offering a critique of everyday life, a critique in action, a basically optimistic critique, with the living human unity of its two faces. The negative and the positive, hence its success. In Chaplin's feature films, the critique becomes broader, taking on a higher meaning. They confront the established bourgeois world and its vain attempts to complete itself and close itself off, not with another world but with a type. This type, a down and out, is the emanation of that other world, its expression, its internal necessity, its essence externalized and yet still internal, to put it abstractly and speculatively, which after all is how Marx expressed his discovery of the proletariat as a class. As necessarily as it produces machines and men machines, the bourgeois world produces deviance, it produces the tramp, its reverse image. The relation between the tramp and the bourgeois order is different to the relation proletariat, bourgeoisie. In particular, it is more immediate, more physical, relying less on concepts and demands than on images. By its false and illusory and euphoric and presumptuous insistence upon the self, the free world immediately creates its pure negative image. Thus the tramp figure contains certain characteristics of the image Marx presents of the proletariat in his philosophical writings, the pure alienation of man and the human which is revealed as being more deeply human than the things it negates, negativity forced by its essence to destroy the society to which at one and the same time it belongs and does not belong. And yet the positivity of the proletariat, its historic mission, is not accomplished on the philosophical or aesthetic level. It is accomplished politically, and philosophical criticism becomes political criticism and action. In the type and the myth presented by Chaplin, criticism is not separable from the physical image immediately present on the screen. If therefore it remains limited, it is nevertheless directly accessible to the masses. It does not lead to revolutionary action or political consciousness, and yet it uses laughter to stir up the masses profoundly. Thus in his best films, Chaplin's humor takes on an epic dimension which comes from this deep meaning. The image of alienated man, he reveals alienation by dishonoring it. 19 Here for the first time we encounter a complex problem, both aesthetic and ethical, that of the reverse image. An image of everyday reality, taken in its totality or as a fragment, reflecting that reality in all its depth through people, ideas and things which are apparently quite different from everyday experience, and therefore exceptional, deviant, abnormal. 20% created by Chaplin achieves universality by means of extremely precise elements. The hat, the walking stick and the trousers, all taken from London's petty bourgeoisie. The transition from the mime to the type marks a date and an expansion in Chaplin's work, an expansion within the work itself and one made possible by that work alone. Suddenly he puts his own previously constructed figure or image at the center of his films. In a very strong sense, he puts himself on the stage. As a result, a new development takes place. Thus the critique of everyday life takes the form of a living dialectical pair. On the one hand, modern times, with everything they entail, bourgeoisie, capitalism, techniques, and technicity, etc. And on the other, the tramp. The relation between them is not a simple one. In a fiction truer than reality as it is immediately given, they go on producing and destroying one another ceaselessly. In this way the comical produces the tragic destroys the comical, and vice versa. Cruelty is never absent from the clowning. The setting for the clowning is constantly being broadened. The city, the factory, fascism, capitalist society in its entirety. But is the comedy defined by its underlying tragedy or by its victory over the tragic? It is in the spectator personally that Charlie Chaplin constantly manages to unite these two ever-present and conflicting aspects, the tragic and the comical. Laughter always manages to break through, and like the laughter of Rabelais, Swift and Molière, i.e.
laughter of their readers or audiences, it denies,
destroys, liberates. Suffering itself is denied, and this denial is put on display. In this fictitious negation we reach the limits of art. On leaving the darkness of the cinema we rediscover the same world as before, it closes around us again. And yet the comic event has taken place, and we feel decontaminated, returned to normality, purified somehow and stronger. To sum up, our analysis has seen Chaplin as a type rather than a myth. Based on general characteristics, poor but full of vitality, weak but strong, ruthlessly seeking money, work, prestige, but also love and happiness. How can an image which so directly reveals what is significant about the so-called modern man be called mythical? In any case, the interesting thing here is not a discussion of the Chaplin myth and the mythical character of the image of life he presents. It is the very fact that an image with its roots deep in everyday life can be seen as mythical, and that the word myth can be used to describe it. Might this illusion be significant on a more general level? The most extraordinary things are also the most everyday. The strangest things are often the most trivial, and the current notion of the mythical is an illusory reflection of this fact. Once separated from its context, i.e. from how it is interpreted, and from the things which reinforce it, while at the same time making it bearable once presented in all its triviality, i.e. in all that makes it trivial. Suffocating, oppressive, the trivial becomes extraordinary and the habitual becomes mythical. In the same way, a humble plant taken from the soil and from the plants around it, seen up close, becomes something marvelous. But then, once images like this have been separated from their everyday context, it becomes very difficult to articulate them in a way which will present their essential everyday quality. This is the secret of talents like Fellini's, La Strada, or that of the directors of Salt of the Earth. 21, and perhaps it offers a potential way ahead for realism. 22, that great man of the Brecht theater who recently passed away, tried to renew realism by proposing a revolutionary formula, epic theater. This formula has provoked more than one misunderstanding. On reading those words, in a country whose culture is traditionally referred to as humanist, it is easy to imagine noble, violent actions unfolding majestically and protagonists fighting for the crown, for their dynasty or their loves. In fact, what Brecht meant was a theater in which action and poetry would be expressly and deliberately brought close to everyday life. When he tried to explain the meaning of the word epic, he used the example of a traffic accident, with witnesses discussing what happened and giving biased accounts of it, each implying a judgment, taking a stand, taking sides, and an attempt to make the listener share that judgment. The epic theater wants to establish its basic model at the street, 23 corner. Brecht's great play about Galileo, that hero of knowledge, begins with a de-heroization. Galileo, washing the upper part of his body, puffing and good-humored. Put the milk on the table. 24 To understand this properly, we think about what is needed happening around us, within us, each and every day. We live on familiar terms with the people in our own family, our own milieu, our own class. This constant impression of familiarity makes us think that we know them, that their outlines are defined for us, and that they see themselves as having those same outlines. We define them. Peter's this, Paul's that, and we judge them. We can identify with them or exclude them from our world, but the familiar is not necessarily the known. As Hegel said in a sentence which could well serve as an epigraph for the critique of everyday life, was ist bekannt ist nicht erkannt. Familiarity, what is familiar, conceals human beings and makes them difficult to know by giving them a mask we can recognize, a mask that is merely the lack of something. And yet familiarity, mine with other people's with me, is by no means an illusion. It is real and is part of reality. Masks cling to our faces, to our skin, flesh and blood. Have become masks. The people we are familiar with, and we ourselves, are what we recognize them to be. They play the roles I have cast them in and which they have cast for themselves. And I myself play a role for them and in them, and not only while they are watching, the role of friend, husband, lover, father, which they have cast me in and which I have cast for myself. If there were no roles to play and thus no familiarity, how could the cultural element or ethical element which should modify and humanize our emotions and our passions be introduced into life? The one involves the other. A role is not a role, it is social life, an inherent part of it. What is faked in one sense is what is the essential, the most precious, the human, in another. And what is most derisory is what is most necessary. It is often difficult to distinguish between what is faked and what is natural, not to say naive, and we should distinguish between a natural naivety and the naturalness which is a product of high culture. The waiter in a cafe is not playing at being a waiter. He is one. 25, and he is not one. He is not selling his time for working and living in exchange for the role of a waiter. And it is precisely when he is playing at being a waiter and a virtuoso in the art of carrying overladen trays, etc., in front of his customers that he is no longer a waiter by playing himself. He transcends himself. Moreover, it is certain that a worker does not play at being a worker and could not transcend himself if he did. He is completely that, and at the same time he is completely other and something else, head of the family, or an individual eager to enjoy life, or a revolutionary militant. For him and within him, at his best moments and his worst, contradictions and alienations are at a maximum. For us, in our society, with the forms of exchange and the division of labor which govern it, there is no social relation with the other, without a certain alienation. And each individual exists socially only by and within his alienation, just as he can only be for himself within and by his deprivation, his private consciousness. 26, it would be too simple to tear off the masks and shatter the roles. To cry faces are nothing more than masks is the answer of cynical irony, the solution a cartoonist might come up with. An irrelevant solution, since they are that, and they are not that, and thus they escape irony on two counts. Still, the very fact that irony is possible immediately reveals the impossibility of any true identification with beings who are not identical with themselves. Now familiarity relies upon apparent identification, upon a belief in identification, upon a practical credulity. Irony begins breaking this belief up. Without necessarily putting a reasonable distance between us and the people we live with, it allows us to begin appreciating the distance between them and their own selves, between them and us. Irony is necessary, it is a powerful weapon ethically and aesthetically, but it is not enough. It plays a momentary role in the critique that everyone makes more or less of their own everyday lives, and it cannot be disregarded. In Brecht, in his poetry as in his plays, there is a constant underlying irony, yet this irony is always transcended by a more deeply serious intent. There is an intense feeling which can be rare or frequent in life according to who one is, but which is certainly frequent in narrative fiction, and which can be put more or less in the following way. He realized that this woman who had been sharing his bed for the last 10 years was nothing more than a stranger to him. Germaine looked at Roger in amazement. It was as though she was seeing him for the first time. For the audience in a theater, this surprise must be made to last, and the distance between the characters, as between the characters and their own selves, must be determined by the distance between the audience, the stage, and the actors. They must be placed at a reasonable distance, but this is just a technical problem, at least as far as Brecht is concerned. No doubt the essential thing is that in the 20th century the people we live with have nothing in common with classical characters, precisely because they play a role in life. In the great classical dramas, by virtue of a contradiction for which they offer a magnificent solution, characters are not characters. They are utterly sincere, authentically sincere even when they are pretending. They are not acting, and this is why actors are able to impersonate them completely. The audience can identify with well-defined beings and natures. Conversely, all around us, in real life, characters really are characters. Plays which attempt to represent them, in other words, to present what is hidden in life in a clear way and at a reasonable distance, must go beyond the classical concept of character. We are dealing with people about whom it is impossible to say either what they are or what they are not. About whom we cannot say that they are not, that they only appear to be what they are, nor that they are or appear to be what they are not. They are undefined and yet they are, and with a vengeance. Presence, absence does not function on the level of the image or the imaginary, but in life. This is precisely why an awareness of what is familiar becomes transformed into an awareness of something strange. As soon as we get really close to someone, we say to ourselves, he's an odd type of chap. She's an odd type of girl. Every type, by which we mean every individual, the opposite of typical, is an odd type of person. 27. The following conversation could be about anyone. You're exaggerating. I don't think he's nearly as complicated as that. That's because you don't know him well enough. Honestly, he's really very nice. Who to? His friends, his little clique. But as far as I'm concerned, it's her fault, the bitch. Come on, don't be so hard on her, and so on. One possible outcome of this is Pirandelloism, which has been fashionable for so long that it must have a deep meaning. Pirandello initiated a theater which is almost perfectly static, and which recently has become even more so. 28. Nothing happens but a series of interpretations and points of view which shed light on a past, absent, or unknown event. Pirandelloism expressed in terms of the theater the relativity, the absolute relativity of characters and judgments, an important discovery of modern times in bourgeois society. There are only points of view, perspectives, masks, and roles. Truth is draped in veils. It can be defined only by an endless succession of points of view, and yet there is something in life which Pirandelloism cannot contain and which escapes it. The action, the event, the decision, the final outcome, and the necessity for a final outcome. Actions and judgments about actions in the sense in which they involve decisions. Even when we are playing, or above all when we are playing, we have to make decisions. 29. To play is to transform our point of view into a decision by confronting chance and determinism in the absence of adequate information about our opponent's game. We must lay our cards on the table, make our play, and quickly. We must make a decision. We do not have all the time in the world, either to shuffle the pack or to think about our partner's hand. In any case, would all the time in the world supply us with complete information? Would it exhaust chance and determination? Would it come anywhere near uncovering their unity? When we are not playing, in other words when we are living seriously, we also come to decisions in the absence of adequate information, confronting chance and determinism, and therefore playing in the deepest meaning of the word. At this point we may at last be defining and grasping something that Brecht understood profoundly. We are never really sure where actions, decisions, or events spring from. 30%, but, in all their stark reality, the results are there. What lies hidden within men and women is beyond our grasp. Maybe these hidden depths are only an insubstantial mist, and not a profound substance, a grund, a nature, an unconscious belonging to the individual or a group. It may only be a myth. Men and women are beyond us, but the battle, however confused, always has an outcome. There before us lies a child, a casualty, or a corpse, a marriage, a life together to organize or to disrupt, a place to live to be found, suffering to endure or avoid, pleasure to enjoy or spoil, a decision to hazard and accept with all its consequences, and this without adequate information, or having lost information en route, etc. 31. Uncertainty is not without its charm or interest. It can never last long. It maintains ambiguity, keeping what is possible in a state of possibility, allowing us to take our pleasure in what Valerie called the whorehouse of possibilities. It can even oscillate the comical and the between dramatic, but we must choose. We weigh the pros and the cons, but there is no telling when something new on one side of the scales will come to outweigh the other. So decisions may ripen like fruit on a tree, but they never fall of their own accord. We must always cut the stem. We must even choose the moment of choice. 32. Hence the infinitely complex, profound, and contradictory character of life is given an element which is always new, and which is indeed constantly being renewed by knowledge. To put it more clearly or more abstractly, ambiguity is a category of everyday life, and perhaps an essential category. It never exhausts its reality. From the ambiguity of consciousnesses and situations spring forth actions, events, results without warning. These at least have clear cut outlines. They maintain a hard, incisive objectivity which constantly disperses the luminous vapors of ambiguity only to let them rise once again. Philosophers and psychologists have confused the issue by sometimes attributing this being their results to consciousness or being, rather than to actions and decisions, and sometimes attributing ambiguity to philosophically defined existence rather than to the everyday as such. Feelings and desires can hardly choose. They would like to choose, they would like not to choose. To possess incompatibles all at the same time. Several skills, several possibilities, several futures, several loves. Practically, the requirement to act and to make decisions imposes choice. But to choose is to make a judgment. We have no knowledge of the human actions which go on around us. They escape us just as our own selves escape us. And yet we must make judgments. And even before or after the epic moment of decision or action, we must go on making ever more and more judgments. It is the only solid ground, the only unchanging requirement amid all life's ups and downs. It's one axis. Such are the varied aspects of the everyday. Fluctuations beneath stable masks and appearances of stability, the need to make judgments and decisions. But nothing is as difficult and as dangerous as making judgments. Judge not. From the very beginnings of social life, men have been obsessed by the function of the judge and the powerful fight among themselves to exercise it. The judge pronounces, makes irrevocable decisions according to the law as it stands, or in the court of appeal. He must embody justice, or law, or the force of truth. God passes for supreme judge, and the myth of the last judgment is a mighty image, the most striking and the most elaborate of all religions. The human masses sustain this great hope. The judge will come. For ordinary men, every one of the innumerable little judgments required in life implies a risk and a wager. We are so used to making mistakes about our fellow man, the good sense tells us to be wary of passing judgment, disapproves of hasty verdicts, and, quite rightly, denounces prejudice. As a result, we find it easier to judge a global society than to judge men. Every capitalist is a man. Within him, up to a point, the man and the capitalist are in conflict. Extreme cases, the capitalist who is the complete incarnation of money and capital are rare. Generally, there are two or more contradictory spirits living inside the capitalist, in particular, as Marx noted. The coexisting needs of enjoyment and accumulation tear him apart. It is therefore both easier and more equitable to condemn a society than to condemn a man. Brecht perceived the epic content of everyday life superbly, the hardness of actions and events, the necessity of judging. To this he added an acute awareness of the alienation to be found in the same everyday life. To see people properly, we need to place them at a reasonable, well-judged distance, like the objects we see before us. Then their many-sided strangeness becomes apparent, in relation to ourselves, but also within themselves and in relation to themselves. In this strangeness lies their truth, the truth of their alienation. It is then that consciousness of alienation, that strange awareness of the strange liberates us, or begins to liberate us from alienation. This is the truth. And at the moment of truth we are suddenly disorientated by others and by ourselves. To look at things from an alien standpoint, externally and from a reasonable distance, is to look at things truly. But this strange and alien way of looking at things, disorientated but true, is the way children, peasants, women of the people, naive and simple folk look. And they are afraid of what they see. For this many-sided alienation is no joke. We live in a world in which the best becomes the worst, where nothing is more dangerous than heroes and great men. Where his everything, including freedom, even though it is not a thing, and revolt, changes into its own opposite. Brecht gave examples borrowed from everyday life. Verfremdungseffekt has become famous, but some technically inclined stage directors tend to turn it into a theatrical device. They achieve a specific effect with a couple of tricks of light and shadow, or with incidental music out of keeping with the real spectacle. When Brecht showed the strangeness of the everyday, pointing out that contradiction within the familiar, whereby it embraces both the trivial and the extraordinary, he was already protesting against this kind of technocratic interpretation. A lorry has just run over a passerby. Policemen run to the scene, people gather around, discussing what has happened. They try to reconstruct the event, but are unable to do so. The witnesses disagree. The driver tries to exonerate himself, throwing the blame on the victim. The fact, the event, is there in all its stark and gory reality. Everyone judges or tries to judge. Everyone takes sides and makes his decision. This is the approach historians, who must make judgments sooner or later, still have towards criticizing evidence. Brecht's epic theater rejects classical transparency. As it happens, a deceptive transparency which in principle extends to the conflicts and problems presented, to the logical unfolding of the actions and events. If he starts from a commonplace, it is the opposite of the classical koinon, 33, and is taken from the everyday. He starts from disagreement, divergence, distortion. The play or the scene poses a complete problem which has not been resolved in advance and which is consequently irritating and embarrassing. To begin with, Brecht confronts the spectator with an action or an event, the quarrel between the Caucasians and the Caucasian chalk circle, for example. He leaves the spectator in a for him disturbing externality. Instead of making him participate in an action or with defined characters, the stage action liberates him. It arouses his capacity for action, forces him to make decisions. He is made to face something by argument. 34 called upon to make a judgment, obliged to come to a decision, the audience hesitates, and in this way the action is transferred to within the spectator. Without being aware of it, and although everything is clearly happening in full view, the spectator becomes the living consciousness of the contradictions of the real. And is it really accurate to say that this theater excludes emotion? It excludes emotion of a magical nature, the kind that allows or implies participation and identification. But maybe Brecht's theater is aiming to bring forth new forms of emotion and images by actually ridding them of whatever magic the imagination has retained. 35 If this were not the case, if Brecht's theater were restricted merely to evoking states of mind, this is where it would come up against its own limitations, and fairly severe limitations they would be. As it happens, it provides a model for art liberated from magic. 36 And that is a great innovation. Brecht unravels the contradictions of everyday life and liberates us from them. For magic plays an immense role in everyday life, be it in emotional identification and participation with other people, or in the thousand little rituals and gestures used by every person, every family, every group. But in practical life as an ideology, this magic only signifies the illusions men have about themselves, and their lack of power. And everyday life is defined by contradictions, illusion and truth, power and helplessness, the intersection of the sector man controls and the sector he does not control. In Brecht's theater, the protagonists are placed in the full glare of the stage, lights, but the very brilliance of the lights and the bareness of the dramatic space deliberately isolate and distance them. Thus the audience can identify neither with the dramatic development nor with such a hero or a character. It is not even a bad thing, at least now and then, for the protagonist to be unsympathetic, irritating. This helps to accentuate the distance. The spectator weighs the pros and the cons. He waits for the play to offer him arguments, but it does so only in a way which delays judgment or provokes judgment without laying down what it should be. A dialogue between the spectator and the spectacle, one dare not say author, is established which brings a growing tension, relieved by musical interludes, the songs. 37. The spectator cannot relax. He is not allowed to. He must take sides. Political, public, contradictory. The play is fundamentally no different from a meeting. The paradox here is that Brecht, who was never a politician, who was never a member of the Communist Party, who had difficulties with the East German authorities, nevertheless offers a model for a political art to which taking sides and making a stand are fundamental. Genuinely so, making the audience do so without presenting it as a fait accompli, without explaining it or imposing it dogmatically. Hence the misunderstandings, which were as painful as they were ridiculous, far from attempting to purify passions and emotions, except in the most fundamental sense of delivering them from the realm of magic. Brechtian's stage narrative stirs them up. Thus it condenses a becoming analogous with practical becoming, the exploration of potentialities, the transition from possibilities to actions and decisions. The denouement is the moment when a judgment is passed, a stand made, a side taken. Therefore the object of the play is something unknown and something strange. An event in the historical sense, a social man, rather than a plot or situation. Given or determinable in the relationships between the characters. Thus the action can very easily be cut up into distinct moments, into relatively independent scenes. It loses the classical characteristics of unity and continuous movement, where a coup de theater is like a sudden blow on the kettle drums in a symphony. Neither interrupts the unity of the whole. There is no internal conflict resolved by the supreme moment of denouement or death. The action is happening more inside the spectator than physically on the stage. Let us sum up. Classical theater transcended everyday life by using heroes, situations, the formal logic of the unities. It purified it. It represented it while filtering its impurities, investing it with noble, majestic outlines. It projected it along a continuous line and within a rigorous framework. It criticized it from outside, using metaphysical or religious norms, which historically were basically the values of the dominant classes. It imposed an identification between the spectator and the hero, his will, his conflicts, his struggle, an identification which included the espousal of accepted norms and values. It is precisely in this way that classical art sanctioned and consecrated one particular aspect of everyday life, a negative. The magic of participation and ritual. Brecht's epic theater immerses itself in everyday life, at the level of everyday life, in other words, at the level of the masses, not simply the masses of individuals, but the masses of instants and moments, of events and actions. Thus it appears as a democratic revolution in the art of the theater. It breaks with the theater of illusions as it does with the naturalist theater which imitates life. It does not purify the everyday, and yet it clarifies its contradictions. In its own way it filters it. It throws its weak part away, the magical part. Thus the Brechtian dramatic image differs from what we called the reverse image in Chaplin. Brecht aims, and he has said so, at an image which will master the facts. Nevertheless, he has used the reverse image procedure on occasion, in Mahogany, for example. Ambitions are Brecht's high justified? Did he achieve his goal? There is no shortage of objections. In the first place, his theater is intended to be physical, direct, and thus popular, but parts of it appear to be excessively intellectual. Nowhere, even in Germany, does it seem to have become truly popular. The spectator wavers between an externalized judgment, an intellectual state which implies high culture, and an immersion in the image proposed. Perhaps this is what the dialectic of the Verfremdungseffekt is. The spectator is meant to disalienate himself in and through the consciousness of alienation. He is meant to feel wrenched from his self, but only in order to enter more effectively into his self, and become conscious of the real and the contradictions of the real. Unfortunately, there is a risk that this process will take on the disturbing form, worse even than classic identification of fascination. Whether it be to compare them or contrast the two, French partisans of Brecht's theater nearly always refer to Antonin Artaud's theater of cruelty. The violence of dramatic effects of the lighting of the images make it even more impossible for the spectator to relax his mind and momentarily resolve his inner tension by identifying with the hero or by escaping into a kind of dream. There is a danger that unity will be re-established momentarily in the spectator's disorientated mind, caught up as he is by the image, for tension needs moments of respite. Expectation demands to be satisfied, if only fleetingly. Unable to find this in a classic completeness, there is a danger that he will look for them in a sort of bloody ecstasy. Therefore generalized strangeness entails a danger, which was avoided by Brecht but not necessarily by the people who produce his plays or write about them. An art based on alienation must struggle against alienation, if not it sanctions it. Significantly, some of his French commentators translate Verfremdungseffekt as effet d'alienation. 38 It would be another paradox, and a very strange one, if this new art were to sanction alienation by giving it all the glamour of violence. In Danton's death, tragedy and fascination are grounded in the irremediable triviality of everyday life. Danton, time loses us. This is very tedious. We put the shirt on first, then we pull the trousers up over it, and every night we crawl into bed, and every morning we crawl out again, and we always put one foot down in front of the other. And it doesn't look as if it's ever going to be any different. 39 Criticism of life by death, surely the last word in lucidity. We should add that the spectator cannot effectively be transformed into a historian of the event, or action or decision, since the historian's attitude is defined in terms of knowledge and not of art. Moreover, to make judgments in life is not the same as adopting the attitude of a judge. The judge's attitude excludes sudden surprises, amazement, expectation. The professional judge pronounces. According to written evidence, he applies the law, he takes the event as having actually happened. Impassive by definition, impartial by principle, he decides without taking sides, such is his duty. And if he behaves otherwise, it is because he has fallen foul of the contradictions of the law, of justice, of truth. in which case it is the judge's turn to be put on trial. Thus it is that the functions of the critique of everyday life can be determined by reference to an art which immerses itself in everyday life. To be creative in art, one must seek a certain pathway, committing oneself to it and pointing the way towards it. The philosopher still has a part to play by pointing out the risks, the dangers, and how a straight line, a linear orientation without deviations, without meanders, is generally a practical impossibility. This is the place or the moment to mention one of the most gifted up and coming French authors, Roger Violland. 40%. This is not only because he has defended classicism against Brecht, 41, but also and above all because Violland the novelist has his own problem, that of confronting everyday life with a vision, or with images from somewhere else. Roger Violland's formative reading was Stendhal and Laclos. He modeled himself on them, and still carries them in his head, even when he is no longer actually using them as models. Thus his attempts to grasp everyday triviality, real, apparent, or both, are honed by a sensibility derived from classical humanism, a carefully cultivated eroticism, and almost romantic novelistic vision. On top of that, he has read the Marxists. Such are the analytic tools with which he hopes to come to grips with the everyday. The resultant, fruitful, contradictions give his attempts great interest beyond whatever specifically literary qualities his books may have. Thus 325,000 francs 42 is a novel which is very close to the apparently most ordinary kind of everyday life, that of a molder in a plastics factory. Someone has said that he wrote it for a bet, to write a romantic novel about overtime. A simple, solid, healthy proletarian is in love with a girl, a working girl, but an isolated one, a dressmaker, who, after playing the field, uses her rather advanced feminine wiles to trap a husband. She teases him, and leads him on through the classic stages of courtship, almost of the pays du tender, to force him to marry her. Roger Violland thus manages to situate his refined eroticism at the center of a novel dealing with the everyday life of the proletariat. Aroused and very much in love, and yet aware of what the girl really is, and in this respect reminiscent of the hero of a classical play, the boy knows that to have the woman he loves he will have to marry her, and that to marry her he will have to leave his class. He would probably aspire to leave it anyway, but surely not at the risk of his life or health. Thus the woman plays the traditional female role, a role which is certainly still a real one of an ambiguous figure who excites contradictory actions and thoughts. The boy seeks fame and fortune in sport and becomes a racing cyclist. When this fails, he is forced to work night and day to earn enough to settle down with his beautiful but demanding lady. It costs him a hand, his health, and his physical mobility. The drama of everyday proletarian life is treated here with true artistry, and this makes the book a work of art. Roger Violland has captured his subject in such a way as to make it at once flimsy, transparent, and profound. The book is written like a musical composition, an opera, with an overture to whet our appetites, containing the themes, presenting the characters, and foreshadowing the continuation and conclusion. A cycle race, watched by the girl who is also the prize, in which the boy makes a heroic effort, only to fall, injure himself, and lose. In this book, as in Violland's earlier novels, the author appears as such. He says I. He intervenes as a witness, designating the characters and situating them, entering into a dialogue with them, inviting the reader to decide what attitude to adopt towards them, what judgment to make. Here judgment is inseparable from event. It is rigorously included in the story. This authorial presence has various meanings, and not simply on the level of technique. It is Roger Violland's way, and a very simple way it is of resolving a difficult literary problem, that of novelistic consciousness, or of consciousness in the novel. Who is speaking? Who is seeing? Who saw the actions in the story? Who bridges the gap between the lived and the true? How has the speaker seen or heard about the things he narrates? How has he been able to foretell or sense what will happen next? Who has detected the character's motives, hidden even to themselves? And as he is drawn on by the great movement called reading, with whom does the reader identify? In whose consciousness does he participate? Roger Violland's solution, the novel's first-person evidence, is not without its drawbacks. It corresponds too closely to the general tendency to bring the novel nearer to journalism and autobiography. Inevitably, as soon as he begins extending his narration, the author will start introducing scenes from which he was absent, or else he will write sentences which are incompatible with his main guidelines and techniques. At the same instant, she saw her father's face again. 44. The presence of the author situates the characters, placing them constantly before our eyes, not too near and not too far away, at a reasonable distance. For Roger Violland, this has the advantage of piquing the reader's interest, and yet the use of his own consciousness as a witness, and virtually as a judge, would remain contemplative and formal if it did not have a solid content. The totality of human and social relations as manifested in the everyday life of a village, a factory, a small industrial town. Conversely, this knowledge of modern everyday life, superimposed as it is upon a great familiarity with classical culture, is characterized by a certain externality of consciousness on the part of the knower or witness. The author's use of the first person thus has a deeper meaning than simply the solving of a problem of novelistic technique. The author is present because in himself he contributes something irreplaceable, because he comes from somewhere else. Because he introduces into a certain kind of everyday experience a lucidity and a recognition which it did not previously contain. Consciousness presents itself in the novel in this way because this is how it occurs in life, at one and the same time from without and from within. We could show here, not without a certain irony, that Roger Violland the novelist is to some extent doing what Roger Violland the writer on drama and the critic of Brecht is rejecting. He composes his novels in an operatic mode. He inserts scenes which are almost independent, and which as it happens are virtually scenes from a play, weddings, dances, arguments, or brawls in pubs, jealous rows, etc. As a witness he passes judgment, makes the reader and takes sides, making him pass judgment, supported by details borrowed from everyday life. 45. The narrative has a spontaneous tendency to become epic. As the critic of L'Express observed on 27 November 1954, Beaumasquet is an excellent epic narrative. That Roger Violland with all his idiosyncratic qualities and faults should be much closer to Brecht than he thinks is really rather curious. It must surely be indicative of one of the requirements of everyday life, or more exactly of the aesthetic representation in drama or in the novel of everyday life. Ulysses' great demonstrates that a novel can be boring, and profoundly boring. Joyce nevertheless understood one thing, that the report of a day in the life of an ordinary man had to be predominantly in the epic mode. Finally, to clarify a few ideas, and above all to amuse the reader, here are two extracts from modern Anglo-Saxon authors. The first attacks American everyday life with a black and chilling irony. By contrast, the second, by a famous and talented English woman writer, uses an acute sensitivity to show the subtle richness of the everyday. The subway, Archer thought, was the only place to read today's newspapers. Underground, in a bad light, at an increased fare, with all the passengers fearing the worst about each other. Everyone suspecting the man next to him of preparing to pick a pocket, commit a nuisance, carry a lighted cigar, pinch a girl, ask for a job, run for a vacant seat, block the door at the station at which you wanted to leave the train. Archer put the paper down and looked around at his fellow passengers. They do not look American, he thought. Perhaps I shall report them to the proper authorities. 46. Archer walked down Fifth Avenue, past the shops with their windows full of dresses, coats, and furs, and the women rushing in and out of the doors, their faces lit with the light of purchase. It is the new profession of the female sex, he thought. Buying. If you wanted to set up an exhibition to show modern American women in their natural habitat, engaged in their most characteristic function, he thought, like the tableau in the Museum of Natural History in which stuffed bears are shown against a background of caves, opening up honeycombs, you would have a set of stuffed women. Slender, high-heeled, rouged, waved, hot-eyed, buying a cocktail dress in a department store. In the background, behind the salesgirls and the racks and shelves, there would be bombs bursting, cities crumbling, scientists measuring the half-life of tritium and radioactive cobalt. The garment would be democratically medium priced, and the salesgirl would be just as pretty as the customer and, to the naked eye at least, just as well dressed, to show that the benefits of a free society extended from one end of the economic spectrum to the other. 47. One goes into the room, but the resources of the English language would be much put to the stretch, and whole flights of words would need to wing their way illegitimately into existence before a woman could say what happens when she goes into a room. The rooms differ so completely. They are calm or thunderous, open onto the sea, or, on the contrary, give onto a prison yard, are hung with washing, or live with opals and silks, are hard as horsehair or soft as feathers. 48. Ivy work and leisure in everyday life throughout history. Criticism of everyday life has been carried on in a number of ways, by philosophy and contemplation, dream and art, violent political or warlike action, by flight and escape. These criticisms have a common element. They were the work of particularly gifted, lucid, and active individuals, the philosopher, the poet, etc. However, this individual lucidity or activeness concealed an appearance or an illusion, and therefore a hidden, deeper reality. In truth, their work belonged to a time and a class whose ideas were thus raised above the everyday onto the level of the exceptional and the dominant. Hence, the criticism of everyday life was in fact a criticism of other classes, and for the most part found its expression in contempt for productive labor. At best, it criticized the life of the dominant class in the name of a transcendental philosophy or dogma, which nevertheless still belonged to that class. This is how we must understand the criticism of the world and the mundane carried out from the Middle Ages until the era of the bourgeois 18th century, when the mundane element burst forth into art and philosophy. In our era, one of the most recent forms which criticism of everyday Life is taken as criticism of the real by the surreal, by abandoning the everyday in order to find the marvelous and the surprising, at one and the same time immanent in the real and transcending it. Surrealism rendered triviality unbearable. 49 This was a good thing, but it had a negative side. Transcendental contempt for the real, for work for example. The long inevitable rift between surrealists and Marxists took place during a memorable meeting of the Association of Writers and Revolutionary Artists, AAR, over the Soviet film Road to Life. 50 And yet, be he an author or not, the man of our times carries out in his own way, spontaneously, the critique of his everyday life. And this critique of the everyday plays an integral part in the everyday. It is achieved in and by leisure activities. The relation between leisure and the everyday is not a simple one. The two words are at one and the same time united and contradictory, therefore their relation is dialectical. It cannot be reduced to the simple relation in time between Sunday and weekdays, represented as external and merely different. Leisure, to accept the concept uncritically for the moment, cannot be separated from work. After his work is over, when resting or relaxing or occupying himself in his own particular way, a man is still the same man. Every day at the same time, the worker leaves the factory, the office worker leaves the office. Every week, Saturdays and Sundays are given over to leisure as regularly as day-to-day work. We must therefore imagine a work-leisure unity, for this unity exists. And everyone tries to program the amount of time at his disposal according to what his work is, and what it is not. Sociology should therefore study the way the life of workers as such. Their place in the division of labor and in the social system is reflected in leisure activities, or at least in what they demand of leisure. Historically, in real individuality and its development, the work-leisure relation has always presented itself in a contradictory way. Until the advent of bourgeois society, individuality, personality 51 could, or rather could only really develop outside productive labor. In antiquity, in the Middle Ages, and even during the period when bourgeois social relations still retained aspects of the social relations bequeathed by feudalism. In the 17th century of the honnête homme, the man who was able to develop himself never worked. However, aristocrats, whether they were clerks still tied to feudalism, or bourgeois honnêtes hommes, such men only appeared to remain outside the social division of labor and social practice. In reality, they were prisoners of the separation of manual and intellectual work. Moreover, directly or not, consciously or not, they had a social function, if only on the ideological level. Leonardo da Vinci was an engineer as well as an artist. Rabelais was a doctor and then a writer, at once an encyclopedic brain and an epic novelist. Montaigne worked in local government, and Descartes was an army officer before becoming a scholar. Insofar as the man of those times was genuinely separated from social practice and devoted to leisure alone, to laziness, he was doomed both in a personal sense and from the point of view of class. Another element must be considered which makes the question even more complicated. In those eras, in those modes of production, productive labor was merged with everyday life. Consider the lives of peasants and craftsmen, for example. What distinguishes peasant life so profoundly from the life of industrial workers even today is precisely this inherence of productive activity in their life in its entirety. The workplace is all around the house. Work is not separate from the everyday life of the family. Formerly the imperatives of the peasant community, the village, regulated not only the way work and domestic life were organized, but festivals as well. Thus up to a point a way of living which strictly speaking did not belong to any one individual, but more to a group of men committed to the ties and limits of their community or guild, could be developed. With bourgeois society these various elements and their relations were overturned. In one sense they became differentiated, separate, in another, they came to constitute a unified whole. Bourgeois society reasserted the value of labor, above all during the period of its ascendancy. But at the historical moment when the relation between labor and the concrete development was emerging, of individuality, labor took on an increasingly fragmented character. At the same time the individual, more and more involved in complex social relations, became isolated and inward-looking. Individual consciousness split into two, into the private consciousness and the social or public consciousness. It also became specialization, separation between differing spheres of activity, etc. Thus at the same time a distinction was made between man as man on the one hand and the working man on the other, more clearly among the bourgeoisie of course than among the proletariat. Family life became atomized, individualism separate from productive activity, and so did leisure. As a result there is a certain obscurity in the very concept of everyday life. Where is it to be found? In work or in leisure, in family life and in moments lived outside of culture? Initially the answer seems obvious. Everyday life involves all three elements, all three aspects. It is their unity and their totality and it determines the concrete individual. And yet this answer is not entirely satisfactory. Where does the living contact between the concrete individual man and other human beings operate? In fragmented labor. In family life? In leisure? Where is it acted out in? The most concrete way? Are there several modes of contact? Can they be schematized as representational models? Or must they be reduced to fixed behavior patterns? Are they contradictory or complementary? How do they relate? What is the decisive essential sector? Where are we to situate the poverty and wealth of this everyday life which we know to be both infinitely rich, potentially at least, and infinitely poor, bare, alienated, which we know we must reveal to itself and transform so that its richness can become actualized, developed and renewed and culture? The discreteness of the elements of the everyday work family and private life, leisure activities, implies an alienation, and perhaps at the same time a differentiation, certain fruitful contradictions. In any event, like all ensembles or totalities, it must be studied in terms of the interrelation of its elements. The social history of leisure shows that during the course of a development in which its various stages may have overlapped or contradicted each other, it has been transformed in fact as well as in theory. 52 And new needs have come into being. At first, leisure gives rise to an undifferentiated global activity which is difficult to distinguish from other aspects of the everyday, family strolls on Sunday, walking. On a higher level, leisure involves passive attitudes. Someone sitting in front of a cinema screen offers an example and a common model of this passivity, the potentially alienating nature of which is immediately apparent. It is particularly easy to exploit attitudes commercially. 53 These finally of all, on the highest level leisure produces active attitudes, very specialized personal occupations, linked to techniques and consequently involving a technical element independent of any professional specialization. Photography, for example. This is a cultivated or cultural leisure. This brief examination immediately reveals the contradictory character of leisure, both in terms of itself and in relation to the everyday. Leisure embraces opposing possibilities and orientations, of which some tend to impoverish through passivity while others are more enriching. Some are undifferentiated, although they may still be worthwhile on a certain level. Others very much the reverse. And while some involve escape into a vacuum, others rediscover nature, an immediate sensory life, through what is sometimes a highly developed technical expertise. Organized sports or amateur films, for example. Therefore, with its fragmentation of labor, modern industrial civilization creates both a general need for leisure and differentiated concrete needs within that general framework. Leisure is a remarkable example of a new social need with a spontaneous character which social organization, by offering it various means of satisfaction, has directed, sharpened, shifted, and modified. In response to such new needs, our civilization creates techniques which nevertheless have an extra technical meaning and character. It produces leisure machines, radio, television, etc. It creates new types of play which transform the old ones, sometimes conflicting with other activities, sometimes overlapping. In the camping holiday, work and leisure are barely distinguishable. And everyday life in its entirety becomes play. Concrete social needs are determined in a way which increasingly differentiates them according to age, sex, and group. They also fall spontaneously into the categories of individual needs and collective needs, for example, the distinction between individual sports and team sports. There is no doubt that today in capitalist, bourgeois society, which has its own way of manipulating the needs arising from a specific level of civilization, the most striking imperative as far as the needs of leisure among the masses are concerned is that it must produce a break. Leisure must break with the everyday, or at least appear to do so, and not only as far as work is concerned, but also for day-to-day family life. Thus there is an increasing emphasis on leisure characterized as distraction. Rather than bringing any new worries, obligations, or necessities, leisure should offer liberation from worry and necessity. Liberation and pleasure, such are the essential characteristics of leisure, according to the parties concerned. 54 There is no more of a sense of genuine leisure about a family get-together than there is about gardening, or doing odd jobs around the house. So those involved tend to reject ambiguous forms of leisure which might resemble work or entail some kind of obligation. The cultural aspect strikes them as being irrelevant, which is not to say that it really is so. They mistrust anything which might appear to be educational and are more concerned with those aspects of leisure which might offer distraction, entertainment, and repose, and which might compensate for the difficulties of everyday life. If we are to believe the subjective opinions revealed by surveys, this is as true for workers, proletarians, as it is for the other social classes. It is thus not the work of art, insofar as it has a role to play in everyday life, the picture or the reproduction hanging in the bedroom. That is liable to constitute an element of leisure. Nor armchair reading, unless it provides thrills or escapism, travel books, stories about exploration or crime novels, or relaxation, picture books, strip cartoons, or reader's digests, evoking nothing so much as pre-digested food. The constitutive elements of leisure are more likely to be images in films, and images in films which are, or at least appear to be, as far away from real life as possible. The first obvious thing that the so-called modern man around us expects of leisure is that it should stop him from being tired and tense, from being anxious, worried, and preoccupied. To use a term which is now very widely used by the public at large, he craves relaxation. There's a veritable ideology and a technicity and a technocracy of relaxation, which is obtained by a variety of procedures. Some passive, ridding life of its content, creating a vacuum; others active, exerting control over actions and muscles. Thus, the so-called modern man expects to find something in leisure which his work and his family or private life do not provide. Where is his happiness to be found? He hardly knows and does not even ask himself. In this way, a world of leisure tends to come into being entirely outside of the everyday realm, and so purely artificial that it borders on the ideal. But how can this pure artificiality be created without permanent reference to ordinary life, without the constantly renewed contrast that will embody this reference? There are plenty of examples in the past of art aiming to embellish everyday life by skillfully transposing it, presenting it in a flattering light, imposing a style on it while acknowledging its real achievements. Flemish and Dutch painting, for example. What is new today in bourgeois society is that a complete break has become imperative, a fact that constitutes a serious obstacle for any attempt at realism in art. Consequently, the art of obtaining this break is now a specific and eagerly exploited commercial technique. Clever images of the everyday are supplied on a day-to-day basis. Images that can make the ugly beautiful, the empty full, the sordid elevated, and the hideous is fascinating. These images skillfully and so persuasively exploit the demands and dissatisfactions which every modern man carries within himself that it is indeed very difficult to resist being seduced and fascinated by them, except by so becoming rigidly puritanical and in rejecting sensationalism, rejecting the present and life itself. The sudden eruption of sexuality in the domain of the image, and more generally in leisure, calls for an investigation in its own right. Our era has witnessed the demise of a certain number of ridiculous taboos, which before becoming ridiculous were very serious indeed, which had imposed a ban on sexual matters, on clothes that externalize sexual characteristics, on bodies, on nudity. And yet it still produces a shock whenever this ban is transgressed, as though it were still in force. Images with a more or less explicit, erotic meaning, or simply the display of a woman's body are violently attractive. The excessive use of such images in advertising has not yet exhausted the effect they have on us, and we may conclude that they correspond to something profound. Displays of sexuality and nudity break with everyday life, and provide the sense of a break which people look for in leisure. Reading, shows, etc. 55 on posters, in shop windows, on the covers of magazines, in films, everywhere there are unclothed women. It is a kind of escapism which from certain angles is more like a generalized neurosis. This sexuality is depressing. This eroticism is weary and wearying, mechanical. There is nothing really sensual in this unbridled sexuality, and that is probably its most profound characteristic. From this point of view, we will not criticize eroticism for being immoral, or immodest, or corrupting to children, etc. We leave that to other people. What we will criticize modern eroticism for is its lack of genuine sensuality, a sensuality which implies beauty or charm, passion or modesty, power over the object of desire, and fulfillment. With modern eroticism, we step outside of the everyday, without actually leaving it. It shocks, it seems brutal, and yet this effect is superficial, pure appearance, leading us back towards the secret of the everyday dissatisfaction. Chaplin gave us a genuine reverse image of modern times, its image seen through a living man, through his sufferings, his tribulations, his victories. We are now entering the vast domain of the illusory reverse image. What we find is a false world, firstly because it is not a world, and because it presents itself as true, and because it mimics real life closely in order to replace the real by its opposite, by replacing real unhappiness by fictions of happiness. For example, by offering a fiction in response to the real need for happiness and so on. This is the world of most films, most of the press, the theater, the music hall, of a large sector of leisure activities. How strange the split between the real world and its reverse images. For in the end it is not strange at all, but a false strangeness, a cheap and nasty, all-pervasive mystery. 56 Of course, the fictional and mystifying world of leisure is not limited to the exploitation of sex, sentimentality, and crime. Sport too will have to be scrutinized. Sport has developed by presenting itself as the culture of the body, of individual energy and team spirit, as a school for health. What have these lofty ambitions achieved? A vast social organization, commercialized or not, and a great and often magnificently spectacular mise-en-scene devoted to competitiveness. The vocabulary is not without its humor. People who go to the races and bet on their favorite horse are known officially as sportsmen. Every football club has its supporters 57, and a supporter can be someone who has never kicked a ball in his life. He goes to the match in his car or by bus or the metro. He participates in the action and plays sport via an intermediary. He quivers with enthusiasm, he fidgets frenetically, but he never moves from his seat. A curious kind of alienation. Sport is an activity which is apparently incompatible with illusion, and yet in fact it confronts us with a reverse image, a compensation for everyday life. So the analysis of the relation between the needs of leisure and the other areas which globally make up everyday life presents many difficult problems. It is not sufficient simply to describe the facts. To obtain an analysis of content, we need a conceptual apparatus to supplement description. In particular, the philosophical concept of alienation is essential. In a sense, it has been introduced from outside. But placed in the context of sociology, it becomes scientific and allows the sociology of everyday life to become a science as well as a critique. George Undertaken Friedman has a long and very richly documented investigation into human labor in which he has attempted to pose the problem of the relations between leisure and work. In substance, this work, Au le travail humain, identifies leisure with freedom and work with necessity. Every day, the sum total of techniques is transforming the conditions of existence. Every instant of life is more and more penetrated by them, and the technical environment surrounding man is becoming more substantial by the day. 59 The notion of a technical environment generalizes the relation between man and machine and extends it to everyday life. However, the sciences of man, whose right to examine mechanization and its effects cannot and be contested, 60 themselves modify the technical environment. They do this by an intellectual, moral, and social reassertion of the value of labor which tightens the link of interest between the worker and society, by strengthening the incentives which justify his work, even if it is fragmented, integrate him within a collectivity. 61 The human problem is therefore a dual one. On the one hand, how to organize labor rationally, and on the other, how to organize leisure rationally, especially compensatory leisure, in which the workers can express their personality. 62 It would seem therefore that freedom in and through work comes principally from of the intervention of psychotechnical or sociological theoreticians, in a word from an intervention, the sciences of man applied to industrial labor. 63 Which assures freedom insofar as it exists in this domain, which according to Friedman is not very far. For the technical environment is following its destiny. It characterizes not only capitalist society 64 but also industrial civilization as a whole. Only the domain of leisure escapes the technical environment, escapes necessity, in other words, escapes depersonalization. In our leisure activities we are already beyond techniques. We achieve a leap from necessity into freedom, from the enslavement of the individual into whatever will permit his self-development. George Friedman has had the indisputable merit of posing problems, and posing them in a wide-ranging way. He takes Marx's arguments about the worker alienated by labor which is itself alienated, and renders them concrete in terms of the era we live in. For Marx, however, the alienation of the worker by fragmented labor and machines is only one aspect of a larger, a total alienation, which is one such as inherent in capitalist society and in man's exploitation of man. It is certain that the development of the productive forces, in other words of techniques, has consequences within the social relations structurally linked to these techniques. Many Marxists have shut themselves away in a class subjectivism. Their understanding of the social relations of production in capitalist regimes is restricted to and blinkered by the notion of class struggle. They have thus neglected to study the relations of production insofar as they are linked with the development of the productive forces. And this despite what Lenin had to say on the subject. Analyzing monopoly capitalism, he demonstrated that, underlying this interlocking, its very base are the changing social relations of production. It becomes evident that we have socialization of production. The private economic and private property relations constitute a shell which no longer fits its contents. 65 By starting from an abstract notion of the class struggle, some Marxists have neglected not only to study the recent modifications of capitalism as such, but also the socialization of production, and the new contents of specifically capitalist relations. Such a study could perhaps have modified the notion of class struggle, leading to the discovery of new forms of struggle. These questions have been put by industrial sociology. Has it resolved them accurately and completely? That is another matter. The undisputed fact is that since Marx's analyses and since Lenin's, the productive forces have developed. And this economic fact cannot but have had consequences on the level of social phenomena. Rather than resolving all the problems, Marx's statements about labor and its relation with leisure inaugurated an area of research. He predicted that work would become man's foremost need. The formula is only superficially clear. Objectively, for society, for the social man, for the collective worker, work has always been the foremost need. Does Marx mean that the individual man will transform this objective need into an essentially subjective one, so that by and in this work he will eliminate alienation? No doubt, but the formula is difficult to accept in relation to modern fragmented labor. Moreover, if we put ourselves at the vanguard of technique and the modern productive forces, and consider the implications of automation, then we will need to interpret it afresh. For automation and transfer, machines tend to differentiate labor by splitting it into very highly skilled work and work for which no skill at all is required. We may certainly affirm that work is the foundation of personal development within social practice. It links the individual with the other workers, on the shop floor, in the social class, in the social system, and also with knowledge. It is through work that the multi-technical education which controls the sum total of the productive processes and social practice is made possible and necessary. And yet the fulfillment of these possibilities presents considerable difficulties, and under no circumstances can the bitty character of labor be seen as conducive to the development of personality. Whatever its social and political context, it is alienating. Elsewhere Marx wrote that this always remains a realm of necessity. The true realm of freedom, the development of human powers as an end in itself, begins beyond it, though it can only flourish with this realm of necessity as its basis. The reduction of the working day is the basic prerequisite. 66 Therefore, according to Marx, the development of the need for leisure and the needs of leisure is deeply significant. Recent French sociology and George Friedman have been right to bring this to the fore, but once that has been said, ought we to accept unreservedly the notion of leisure as the breakthrough of freedom into necessity, or as a leap from necessity into freedom? As Marx said, and as Hegel said before him, necessity does not disappear in freedom, and freedom relies upon necessity. We cannot conceive of them as external to one other except relatively. The notion of free leisure is valid up to a certain point. Beyond that point, it is inadequate. If we push it too far, we run the risk of forgetting that there can be alienation in leisure just as in work and alienation, precisely insofar as the worker is trying to disalienate himself. Thus, the dialectical analysis of leisure and its relation with work, an analysis which is an integral part of the critique of everyday life, would seem in some ways to complement the investigations of both the industrial sociologists and the sociologists of leisure. Within the framework of bourgeois society and the capitalist regime, work is lived and undergone by the worker as an alien and oppressive power. Not only do the technical division and the social division of labor overlap and impose themselves on him without his knowing the reasons why, but also he knows that he is not working for himself, either directly or indirectly. Moreover, the fragmented character of individual labor is in fact interdependent with the increasingly complete socialization of productive labor. Fragmentation and socialization are the dialectically contradictory aspects of the labor process wherever the productive forces are highly developed. Fragmented labor can only be meaningful and productive within global or total labor. Thus for the worker a dual need develops in respect of his own labor. On the one hand, the worker aspires to a knowledge of the system in which he plays an integral part, a firm and also a global society. And this is already a means of not submitting, of freeing himself from imposed constraints, of mastering necessity. In capitalist firms this confused but real aspiration is answered in a mystifying way by human relations and public relations. 67 Marxists who have criticized these recent, originally American institutions have made the mistake of merely seeing the ideology they embody, and of ignoring the fact that they correspond to a real social need born precisely from the socialization of labor. They have disregarded the socialization of labor, imagining that it happens only in socialist regimes, whereas it is in fact also a function of the development of the productive forces. They have not understood that in socialism knowledge satisfies a need which under capitalism is answered by an ideology. Reciprocally, the mistake of the non-Marxist industrial sociologists has been that they have not always shown that these innovations, human relations, etc., were responding to needs purely in order to harness them, twist them, deflect them from their meaning, by reducing them to the dimensions of the firm and to cooperation with the employers. Moreover, the worker craves a sharp break with his work, a compensation. He looks for this in leisure, seen as entertainment or distraction. In this way, leisure appears as the non-everyday in the everyday. We cannot step beyond the everyday. The marvelous can only continue to exist in fiction and the illusions that people share. There is no escape. And yet we wish to have the illusion of escape as near to hand as possible. An illusion not entirely illusory, but constituting a world both apparent and real, the reality of appearances and the apparently real, quite different from the everyday world, yet as open-ended and as closely dovetailed into the everyday as possible. So we work to earn our leisure, and leisure has only one meaning: to get away from work. A vicious circle. Thus is established a complex of activities and passivities, of forms of sociability and communication which the sociologist can study. Although he cannot describe or analyze them without criticizing them as being partially illusory, he must nevertheless start from the fact that they contain within themselves their own spontaneous critique of the everyday. They are that critique insofar as they are other than everyday life, and yet they are in everyday life, they are alienation. They can thus hold a real content, correspond to a real need, yet still retain an illusory form and a deceptive appearance. Thus leisure and work and private life make up a dialectical system, a global structure. Through this global structure we can reconstruct a historically real picture of man and the human at a certain step in their development, at a certain stage of alienation and disalienation. Examples? Some are to be found in the present volume, others will be analyzed in the next. Let us list them briefly. The cafe, generally an extra, familial and extra, professional meeting place, where people come together on the basis of personal affinities, in principle and at least apparently, because they have the same street or the same neighborhood in common rather than the same profession or class. Although there do exist cafes where the clients are predominantly of the same class or profession. It is a place where the regulars can find a certain luxury, if only on the surface, where they can speak freely about politics, women, etc., and where if what is said may be superficial, the freedom to say is fiercely defended, where they play. The fun fair, a people's event whose survival and indeed industrialization have occasioned much astonishment. The noise and the deafening music supply the required break. Here we enter a humble, restless microcosm, extraordinary and vulgar, and apparently cheap. Only things which might remind us of work are excluded from this microcosm. In it we find knowledge, the aquarium, anatomical displays, eroticism, naked dancers, travel, wonders, departures, sport, etc. Radio, and even more so, television, the sudden violent intrusion of the whole world into family and private life, presentified in a way which directly captures the immediate moment, which offers truth and participation, or at least appears to do so. Here again we come up against certain characteristics specific to cultural or cultivated leisure. These forms of leisure have functions which are both new and traditional, comparable with reading books, listening to songs and poems, or perhaps dancing as it used to be. Their content is not only entertainment and relaxation, but also knowledge. They do not exclude productive activities, specialized techniques, but they control them. Sometimes it is a matter of techniques which have been rendered obsolete by production and which have become or are in the process of becoming sports, sailing for example. Finally, as we have already mentioned, the ultimate characteristic of such cultivated leisure activities is that they lead us back towards the feeling of presence, towards nature and the life of the senses, or, as the experts would say, towards an audio-visual milieu revitalized by modern techniques. Of all the leisure activities concrete sociology should scrutinize, there is one which nowadays seems particularly remarkable. Everyone knows that for more than a century the French school of painting has enjoyed worldwide renown. But do enough people realize that in France painting is becoming a mass art? That France, for reasons which as yet remain obscure, is becoming a nation of painters, Sunday painters, people who spend their leisure time painting, exist in their tens and perhaps hundreds of thousands. Innumerable local or corporate art exhibitions are held. Thus, at a very high cultural level, leisure transcends technical activity to become art. On this level, it seems to be using a certain means of expression in order to re-establish a hold on life in its entirety. In this context, leisure involves an original search, whether clumsy or skillful is unimportant, for a style of living, and perhaps for an art of living, for a kind of happiness. To sum up, work, leisure, family life, and private life make up a whole which we can call a global structure or totality on condition that we emphasize its historical, shifting, transitory nature. If we consider the critique of everyday life as an aspect of a concrete sociology, we can envisage a vast inquiry which will look at professional life, family life, and leisure activities in terms of their many-sided interactions. Our particular concern will be to extract what is living, new, positive, the worthwhile needs and fulfillments from the negative elements, the alienations. Some overviews on the modern world. As I look up from writing these pages, I see before me one of the loveliest landscapes in the suburbs of Paris. In the distance, the long, lazy curve of the Seine, calm and blue, with its strings of barges. Rows of sparkling cars are driving across the Pont de Saint Cloud, a hill to the left, another to the right. On these hills, groves of trees, gardens, meadows, the last remnants of royal or princely domains. On their island, between the noble lines of these hillsides, I can see the concentrated power of the Renault factories. But nearer, tumbling down the groove of the valley of the Sèvres like insects, in a prosaic disorder, little houses separated by kitchen gardens where guard, dogs bark and cats wail at night. They are called pavilions, but no irony is intended. Between these pavilions lie alleyways, muddy paths where the puddles are never dry. Their owner's superficiality oozes forth in an abundance of ridiculous details: china animals on the roofs, glass globes, and well-pruned shrubs along the miniature paths, plaques adorned with mottos, self-important pediments. From my window I can a huge notice nailed to a tree in one of the kitchen gardens proclaiming, danger of death. Keep out. On Sunday mornings, especially when the weather is fine, these little houses open their entrails to the sun with strings of red eiderdowns, sheets, blankets. They spread over the hillside like hundreds of dead chickens in a window. Immense shop, not much poverty here. The slums are farther down, and yet not only bourgeois and petty bourgeois live on these hillsides, there are also factory employees, workers. Your neighbor could be a taxi driver. In the distance, tumult, power, creation, luxury, and poverty as well. Here the city has grown itself an appendix. In among the remnants of a mighty past it has established something terrifying, mediocrity. But for the Algerian workers at Renault, and for many others besides, going into one of these little houses would be like entering heaven. Why should I say anything against these people who, like me, come home from work every day? They seem to be decent folk who live with their families, who love their children. Can we blame them for not wanting the world in which they feel reasonably at home to be transformed? Platitude. There are still contrasts here which give it a certain charm. A few more little developments, and even that will disappear. Mediocrity will have swamped this Parisian suburb just as it has swamped villages as much as 10 kilometers away from the city. One has to go back to the office buildings in the center of Paris to rediscover something of the beauty or charm of times gone by. Will there ever be anything great which is not dehumanized, or a form of happiness which is not tinged with mediocrity? The picturesque is disappearing with a rapidity which provides the reactionaries with an ample supply of ammunition for their proclamations and jeremiads. Above all, it is being reduced to its vile essence, poverty. What used to be its spark of beauty, the primitive diversity of everyday man, the generosity of his nature, the many-faceted local eccentricities, the brutal swarming tumult, that beauty has disappeared. It has become congealed into so many museum pieces floating on the muddy ocean of destitution. What disappointments await the naive traveler to the famous cities of the fabulous East? Were all those old storytellers lying? Did they see things differently then? Can things and people have changed so much? The eagerly awaited wonders, the marvelous surprises, the ruins, the monuments, the stories from the 1001 Nights, the folk songs and dances, they are no longer enough to color the spectacle and transform it for us. Naples, Baghdad, Calcutta, the same sun shines down on the same rags, the same running sores. The myths have disappeared, the rituals and magic spells have lost their glamour. All we can see now are the destitute masses, and the ignoble apparatus of domination which lies over them, the unlovely art of power. There is nothing left to seduce us, everywhere. A bare-faced display of force, rifles, armored cars, policemen, wherever people are in the throes of liberation from the old oppressions. They are also sacrificing, there is no way they can avoid it, certain ways of life which for many years were great and beautiful. The tractor and the mechanical seeder must replace the gestures of the plowman. Thus when backward countries move forward they produce ugliness, platitude, and mediocrity as though that meant progress. And the advanced countries which have known history in all its greatness produce platitude as though its proliferation were inevitable. So the new China, from the lowliest peasant girl to the highest party chief, dresses up in blue overalls. She has given up the mandarin silks, for hundreds of millions of peasants the direct opposite of their own rags. She has relegated them to museums, or turned them into export items, along with the magic dragons and ivory Buddhas. She is becoming austere, her mind bent on being victorious on the labor front. Solid republics are founded on virtue. In the USSR in September and October 1954 various articles appeared which presented some new problems. The Communist of 14 October suggests that the standard of culture in the Soviet Union and the handling of dialectical analysis were reaching a point where the simplified black or white good versus bad view of reality, which had been generally accepted hitherto, would have to be abandoned. Thus writers, artists, and philosophers needed to set about examining reality and life in all their aspects, distinguishing between their various elements, discerning the seeds of the new germinating in the old, separating the positive from the negative but also grasping all the contradictions, even in what was new. At the same time, and to borrow a time-hallowed formula, this was no coincidence, the problem of taste was raised in the USSR for the first time. On the 10th of October, the review Novy writes, during the period of the construction of communist society, the problem arises of how to elaborate a style of living and material culture which will best satisfy popular requirements. There follows a comparison between the industrial aesthetic of cars and railway engines, and the aesthetic anachronism of the objects on sale in the Moscow stores. Sofas with fringes, beds with fruit and flower decorations, imitations of the mirrors and knickknacks to be seen in the Savoy, a restaurant frequented by tradesmen under the old regime. And the philosopher Alexandrov, who was then Minister of Culture, is quoted for his part as follows. Everything surrounding man in his everyday life, houses, architecture, the organization of living space, furniture, and household objects, is also part of culture and influences taste. The Soviets are thus discovering problems which we, who live in a capitalist country, have been aware of for a long time, which does not mean that we have solved them. As far as the style of everyday life is concerned, the Soviets have not progressed far beyond 1900s. They are discovering social needs which are already known and which have already been explored, which is not the same thing as saying that they have been satisfied or fulfilled. They have attained petty bourgeois mediocrity as though that were progress. How easily and quickly will they leave it behind them? Today the latest stop is the industrial aesthetic, an old chestnut which is liable to involve them in more than one lapse of taste. These observations are not intended to imply any hostility or even mistrust of the USSR, which remains the objective support of the democratic forces and the socialist movement. On the contrary, that a great civilization in the process of formation should express such problems frankly and lucidly can be considered a sign of its vigor and innovativeness. But nevertheless, these facts give food for thought. We observe that socialism and the construction of socialism also involve criticism of everyday life. While not necessarily agreeing with Jean-Marie Domenov's conclusions, we can accept what he has to say on the subject of Yugoslavia. We have failed to pay enough attention in our analyses to this more immediate and less easily grasped reality of everyday life. Let us not forget it, Marxism started from a concrete observation of alienation and aimed to eliminate it. Nothing would be more useful today than a sociology of everyday life, separate from proclamations and official statistics. A sociology of the conditions of real existence in a socialist country. We could take a fresh look at the shortages and the sufferings which lead to unexpected explosions of unrest. By studying new alienations, we could achieve a newly conceived revolutionary theory which would no longer be based exclusively on the poverty of the workers in 1850, but on the concrete sufferings of the men of 1956. Sadly, no such sociology exists as yet in any of the popular democracies, although objective surveys on work, youth, etc. would help to avoid a good many wrong turns. And we have to make do with fragmentary impressions, naturally subject to chance, mood, and therefore extremely questionable. 68. This leads us in turn to pose yet more problems. A few years ago, the new man, the socialist or communist man, seemed radically and infinitely different from what we are. We who are immersed in capitalism and contaminated by the bourgeoisie even in terms of the way we struggle against it. This is how literature presented the new man, entirely positive, heroic, fearless, and blameless in work, war, or love. He was defined by his wholehearted devotion to socialist society, and by the way he discovered the meaning of his individuality in dedication and self-sacrifice, that the individual was dedicated to society, that he was defined as well as determined by society, was never doubted for 1 minute. And this affirmation formed the basis for both an ethic and an aesthetic. However, neither this ethic nor this aesthetic was ever successfully or clearly formulated. Even less was anything definitive written, or a style of living developed, which might have imposed them. Is that not an indication, the visible sign of a flaw, the symptom of something lacking? In fact, it became clear that the exaltation of the social man in socialist society was ending up as a set of perfunctory images of limited interest and certainly of limited use once they had outlived certain specific circumstances, the struggle for the plan, production goals, or the war effort. So in place of the monotonous display of positive heroes, there was a demand for images of the real man, diverse, individual, complete with his conflicts and contradictions, and exemplified in his different types. There was even an official statement to the effect that certain negative types were not without interest, and that there were a great many men and women who experienced within themselves the clash between the old and the new, the positive and the negative, men and women in transition. Thus it is in his similarities with how men used to be that the new man becomes humanized, and we find the socialist or communist man much more interesting when the distance between him and us is reduced. He gains in sympathy and interest what he loses in terms of his ability to impress the naive and the stupid. Even if the contradictions are different, even if they must be emphasized in different ways, even if over there they are fruitful while back here they are devastating, even if the attitude of the socialist man towards his work in society is totally different. To ours, the contradictions allow to understand, to know, to communicate. They enlighten us. In the past, an over-facile rhetoric has taken the socialist man and the communist man over, comparing them to saints, to knights in shining armor. From our lowly positions, we looked up in admiration at the positive hero. It was not possible to love him. Now that he has become contradictory, the socialist man is no taller than we are. But this means we can ask him questions. But this means we become more demanding. We ask ourselves, what is socialism exactly? How does it intervene in everyday life? What does it change? And the answer is unclear. The elimination of the bourgeoisie and class antagonisms, the suppression of capitalist relations of property and production, these are only negative definitions. We find the picture of a bourgeois society without a bourgeoisie neither reassuring nor satisfying. We think that there is, or will be, something else. But what? Accepting one's work, making it willingly if possible, one's first priority, working harder, willing productivity to increase rather than merely putting up with it? These ideas are fine as far as they go. Admittedly, they are probably all essential, very important for the social relations of production, and perhaps they would go some way towards defining a mode of production economically. But as a definition of a culture, a civilization, a humanity, a joy of living which are really new, they are inadequate. Nor can they define a worthwhile way of living which could come into being thanks to its own powers of persuasion. 69. The problem is not limited to ethics and aesthetics. It forces us to return to the theoretical and scientific principles of Marxism. What is the exact role of the productive forces in society? Unquestionably, production in the USSR and in the other countries of the socialist camp is growing at an increasingly rapid rate. And above all, so are the means of production, Marx's department. It is ludicrous to define socialism solely by the development of the productive forces. Economic statistics cannot answer the question, what is socialism? Men do not fight and die for tons of steel or for tanks or atomic bombs. They aspire to be happy, not to produce. What is more, both production, global or per capita, and labor productivity are even higher in the USA than they are in the USSR. The productive forces do not define socialism. For socialism, it is necessary for the productive forces to be at a high level, as the example of the USSR shows, but that is not enough to institute it, as the example of the USA shows. And yet if life is to change, it is essential for the productive forces to reach a certain level. Moreover, a change in the political superstructure, in its class nature, here the bourgeois state, there the proletarian state, controlling the means of production, the dictatorship of the proletariat, its leading role embodied in and exercised by the party, does not ipso facto imply a concrete change in the way people live. In the capitalist countries, the superstructures, the shells in the sense Lenin used the word in the text quoted earlier, are in contradiction with the living contents, because they lag behind them, whether it be the state or legal relations of property. This superstructural backwardness acts as a brake, and it will be the task in the meaning of the political revolution to destroy these shells, to release their contents, and to rebuild new superstructures from the bottom up. In the countries which are building socialism today, the political and ideological superstructures start off ahead of the social relations and the economic base. In the backward countries, this is what the revolution is all about. But how is the contradiction resolved? How is a change which in these backward countries begins at the top, in the stratosphere of society, passed downwards through an immense apparatus into the humble depths of everyday life? Will it not sometimes come to a halt on the way? Will not whatever comes between the base and the apex slow it down or divert it? To put it another way, socialism, the new society, the new life, can only be defined concretely on the level of everyday life, as a system of changes in what can be called lived experience. 70 now, half a century of historical upheavals have taught us that everyday relations between men lived experience change more slowly than the structure of the state, and in a different way, at a different rate. Thus in the history of society's modifications in the different sectors take place unevenly, some ahead of their times, others lagging behind. The fact that one sector is ahead does not mean that there's immediate progress in another, and vice versa. According to the productive and technical forces, certain social needs arise in bourgeois society which capitalism is unable to satisfy. They modify everyday life in a positive way, while at the same time introducing negative elements such as dissatisfaction, disappointment, alienation. On the other hand, in the socialist countries, or in the countries in which socialism is being built, the real social needs, which socialism should both stimulate, detect, and satisfy, lag behind ideology and the superstructures. Let us summarize and put what we have said into perspective. Today, the revolution has lost its mythical meaning and the now outmoded aspects of its former romanticism. In 1917, as in 1789, the revolutionaries thought they were entering straight into another world, an entirely new one. They were passing from despotism to freedom, from capitalism to communism. Just one sign from them and life was going to change like a stage set. Today we know that life is never simple. There are no magic wands. We have been taught to look at necessary revolution in a hard, realistic light. Still inadequately controlled by human will and freedom, necessity has produced a historical result that Marx did not foresee. The political revolution, which is a necessary condition for the transformation of the world, was first accomplished in the backward, underdeveloped countries. The incalculable consequences of this fact are springing up all around us, filling our inexorably with tension and discord. This relationship of confrontation between two politically opposed camps or worlds is extending and amplifying the class struggle to worldwide historical dimensions. But only a shamelessly absurd logic era could mistakenly conclude from this contradiction, this coexistence and antagonism, that the men in these two camps and the way they actually live had nothing in common. In his lectures at Sverdlovsk University in 1924, Stalin defined the spirit of Leninism as the synthesis of Russian revolutionary enthusiasm and American pragmatism. Since then, now that the romanticism has faded away, the balance has possibly tipped in favor of the American sense of business, yield, results. Is this a bad thing? Certainly if it is, it has its positive side. It is true that one of the camps is on the decline while the other is expanding. The latter may well be able to incorporate whatever is best or more effective in the former. But to define the new by sifting out everything that distinguishes it from the old is not as easy as the dogmatists with their lack of dialectic used to believe. Our era is truly an era of transition. Everything about it is transitory, everything, right down to men and their lives. The informed observer will be struck as much by similarities as by differences, as much by the unity within contradiction as by contradiction itself. The one must not eliminate the other. A little example quoted from a comedian. There are secret police in democratic countries as well as in reactionary or fascist countries. In the democratic countries, police chiefs are changed very often. In the socialist countries, sometimes they even shoot them. Under fascism, they last as long as the regime. Today, despite the extreme unevenness of development, a sort of vast worldwide leveling process is taking place. The myths and the ideologies are falling. They are nothing more than shells concealing very badly facts, results, needs. Backward social structures are collapsing, giving way to demands that the social average be raised, average level achieved to the average in the developed countries. From one side of the world to the other, questions are being asked about production and productivity, power of consumption, distribution of the gross national product, diversification of investments, and the socialist countries realize that one day or another they will be obliged to do voluntarily and consciously what the capitalist countries have done involuntarily and blindly: invest in the production of consumer goods. So everywhere we see that advanced automated machines, power stations, and atomic energy, tractors and combine harvesters are being perceived as a hope and a solution. But the man-machine relation is only one aspect of the question. Men and women everywhere are aspiring to build their everyday lives on a solid basis, to escape from insecurity and poverty. These are mass problems, problems of social aspirations and social needs. The face of the world is changing. Everywhere the everyday nature of life asserts itself, conscious now of its own weakness and its own value. Life is appearing in all its nakedness. The result for this period of transition is an appalling outburst of platitude, which is in singular contrast to the other characteristics of the same period. Inordinate ambitions, failures on a par with those ambitions, tragedies, threats, an ocean of blood and mire and with brutal stupidity. And platitude thrown in for good measure. Should we attempt to escape from platitude through the past, the tragic and the mythical, the surreal or the transcendental, or through the marvelous, in other words, through the trumpery of lost illusions and miracles? In the course of our study, we will attempt wherever possible to demonstrate the new marvels which are being born at the very heart of mediocrity. They are simple, human marvels. Let us name one of them without further ado. Trust. It is as old as social life itself, very close to naivety, to foolishness, always abused from childhood on. Trust in one's parents, in masters and bosses, priests and gods, faith and destiny, love, always changed into a distrust which is almost as unexpressed as the initial naivety. Today trust in life is taking root in life and becoming a need. In the contradictory dualism trust, distrust contradictory in an embryonic, suppressed way, more ambiguous than antagonistic, trust is slowly getting the upper hand. In spite of the most dreadful trials, the most awful illusions, it is getting stronger. Today trust is bursting forth, today trust is growing. We will see how it is at work deep in the heart of the everyday, and how it works through its opposite, doubt, the restless need for material security. This will be one of the themes of the second volume of Critique of Everyday Life. 71 Vi once again, the theory of alienation. Now let us return to several questions which we touched upon at the beginning and elucidate them more thoroughly. A certain number of Marxists, and notably the official Marxists, gave this book a rather bad reception when it was first published. Why? In the first place, at that time in France there was a widespread prejudice against sociology, due to the fact that certain theoreticians of the kind generally described from the political point of view as right-wing socialists had reduced Marxism to a sociology. Marxist revolutionaries had drawn the hasty conclusion that sociology does not exist as a science. Indeed, in the USSR, sociology is not included among the social sciences. When the term is used there, it is in reference to societies generally, either ethnographically or ethically or even simply administratively. That there are ideologues, notably in Germany, Weber, Mannheim, etc., who have reduced the historical and social sciences, together with philosophy and the theory of knowledge, to sociology, is offered as an irrefutable argument. But this is merely a way of avoiding, by pure and simple negation, the real difficulties the sociologist encounters when he wants to situate and determine the object and method of his discipline. We should add that the disappearance of sociology from the USSR and from revolutionary Marxism surely has another deeper significance. We have already quoted an important text by Lenin, which demonstrates how the materialist analysis of social relations in Marx goes beyond political economy, by renewing it. Far from excluding a scientific sociology which would study social relations or certain aspects of them, the notion of socio-economic formation demands and requires it. We may note that the concept of socio-economic formation has almost disappeared from Marxist writing to be replaced by the simplified scheme, economic-based political superstructure. Theoretically, Marxist thought and method have become impoverished. Practically, neither capitalist society nor socialist society in the process of formation has been studied in a concrete way. Economic statistics on the one hand, and observations attacking or defending ideology and the political apparatus in the two camps on the other, have been deemed sufficient. This reveals an extremely serious development, the growing break with objectivity which, in our view, characterizes the Stalinist interpretation of Marxism. This dogmatic and schematic simplification of Marxism, with its elimination of sociological research, went hand in hand with the simplification of philosophy. Why was the concept of alienation treated with such mistrust? Why was the Hegelianism in Marx's early writings rejected? Where does the tendency to separate Marx from his roots and his mature scientific works from his early writings come from? Or the tendency to date and determine the formation of Marxism from his political writings? Analysis shows that behind all this lies that murky mixture of simplistic empiricism, pliant subjectivism and doctrinaire, authoritarian dogmatism, which is the philosophical basis of the Stalinist interpretation of Marxism. In Soviet society, alienation could and must no longer be an issue. By order from above, for reasons of state, the concept had to disappear. Why? Was it because alienation, economic, ideological, political, really had disappeared? The divorce between Stalin's decree and the between ideology, brought into line with propaganda, and the objective truth, could only get wider. Reality, this was why the Marxists who imported the Stalinist interpretation to France, not merely uncritically but actually shooting down the slightest hint of criticism as though it were treason, could not accept sociology as a science, or the philosophical concept of alienation, or even philosophy as such. They had to be reductive, simplistic, schematic, dogmatic, and of course the Stalinist interpretation of Marxism 72, which had already been pedagogically and politically simplified, and bent in the direction of a state ideology, could only become even more desiccated. So dogmatic was their attitude that all they could see in the critique of everyday life was an attempt to analyze certain aspects of bourgeois society sociologically, without actually making a stand against it. They imagined it was taking a step backwards, that it was giving up political economy and even dialectical and historical materialism. Sectarian and dogmatic Marxist criticism frequently begins by isolating texts from their context, and then from the author's other works, in order to pin down some formula or other. They considered my sociological point of view to be narrow and depoliticized, as if the sociology annihilated all ideological or political criticism. Sectarian Marxists have nothing much to say, and everything they have to say they say over and over again. When they were unable to find what they were looking for immediately in my book, insisted that I had deliberately left it out. These attacks were spoken rather than written, and took place more by word of mouth behind my back than in actual discussions with me. Here are some extracts from a letter written by a young Marxist who was otherwise sympathetic towards the book. Your critique ends up being a theory of the decline of everyday life, of the growing alienation of a naive way of life in which you sometimes appear to see the remains of a golden age for humanity. Alienation in production consists above all in the fact that the worker is deprived of a share of the product of his labor. Mystification, the superstructure, also deprives the workers of an objective vision of the relations of production. This superstructure, this ideological alienation is complex. Human relations hypostatized in religion, justified in ethics, explained by the pseudo-social sciences, by the political ideology of the dominant classes, etc. But it cannot be said that social man has undergone a process of increasing alienation, for example by passing from slavery to serfdom and the proletariat. Some of your propositions suggest that you believe that the analysis of everyday life can only begin with the theory of ideological mystification. You say that the scientific study of society and of the proletariat begins by tearing away the veil of ideologies, and that Marxism describes in analyses the everyday life of society. But this is all grist to the mill of those who maintain that you are limiting Marxism to a sort of materialist phenomenology of the superstructures. It would be worth your while to actually say that you are writing a theory of the superstructures. You also seem to be saying all the parts of Marx's writings are of equal importance. Your enemies have used this declaration that Marxism constitutes a whole, and is therefore science and a philosophy, to conclude that you see economic facts and ideologies as having equal importance. That accusation of phenomenology again, and it is telling. This letter is a good illustration of how confused the ideas and discussions were. Moreover, they were never openly discussed in public or explored in any depth. Before replying briefly, this is an appropriate place to emphasize another shabby polemical procedure associated with sectarian Marxism. In fact, whether historically or today, Marxist thought and the Marxist thinker cannot exist in isolation from each other. Absolute Marxism and the purely Marxist manner of thinking are intellectual entities created by dogmatism. This dogmatism has become entangled in the very contradictions it has unwittingly created. In fact, Marxism asserts that all thought, can only express itself historically, socially, contextually, using the pronoun generically. I'm a French Marxist who writes and thinks in French, who's been formed by French culture. One would not have to go very deeply into my dialectical thinking to find a predilection for lucid, well-organized, clearly articulated ideas for analysis. Clearly I have a rationalist and Cartesian background. It is indeed conceivable that at one time or another these tendencies of mine may conflict with the materialist and dialectical thinking which, despite its differences with my background, is my starting point, and I know this. It is equally conceivable that I have resolved this conflict, or that I will resolve it in a creative way. And what could be more natural than such a conflict, given that everything is contradictory and that we only move ahead in and through contradictions? But here comes the sectarian dogmatic Marxist. Frowning, threatening, contemptuous, or indifferent, he smells something he disapproves of, something incompatible, something impossible. One cannot be both a Cartesian and a Marxist. Different Marxism is radically from Cartesianism in respect of its theory, its content, its aims. Therefore he will define me as a Cartesian, fixing me forever, labeling me, nailing me to the whipping post of Cartesianism. And he will be very pleased with himself. He will have served the cause of Marxism and the proletariat. And if I answer back, he will brand me with other labels, other epithets. In fact, he will have transformed a problem. In other words, a real conflict, and therefore a creative one insofar as I am able to resolve it, into an irresolvable, unproductive antinomy. He will have burdened living reality with a parasitic growth, his interpretation, and he will have been drawn unwittingly into contradiction between the point of view of Marxism and the proletariat, and the point of view of acquired culture and national tradition, between the point of view of the new and that of the old. It is true that subsequently the sectarian can save face by jumping nimbly from one point of view to the other. He can even maintain that there is no contradiction between the points of view, which is true, since it is he who introduced the contradiction in the first place, exaggerating it to the point of antagonism when necessary, and dismissing it when no longer required. And now we are gradually isolating a process of degeneration in dialectical thought, points of view, and the jump from one point of view to the other. Thus it is fashionable for the dogmatists to use dominant modes of thought from outside Marxism against anyone who attempts to introduce new ideas. Phenomenology is fashionable, then they see phenomenology in every idea which does not duplicate the proven formulas. If Hegelianism is in fashion, then they will find Hegelianism wherever they want to find it, etc. And maybe, indeed certainly, there is something true in all this, since all phenomenology, Hegelianism, or Cartesian analysis also correspond to something around us and within after us. If not, they would have lost all meaning or would not have meant anything in the first place. And this is one of the worst aspects of dogmatism. As soon as it touches a sore point, it turns it only too easily into a global condemnation, using a constant process of superfluity and imperturbable logic instead of analyzing works, situations, and men dialectically. Dogmatism is a great evil which comes in countless forms. If we are to exterminate it, we must hunt it down in every nook and cranny and drag it from its hiding place by the tail like a rat. The amusing thing is that the man who wrote the letter quoted above begins by rejecting this form of criticism. Then he appears not only to accept it, but actually to overshoot the mark by seeming to embrace a theory of superstructures which is a theory of superstructures and nothing else. Thus he wavers between dogmatism and theoretical opportunism or eclecticism. Sectarian criticism also forgets that the economic and the ideological as they are expressed in everyday life only attain the level of political consciousness at moments of revolutionary crisis. This is something Lenin wrote about at length in his analyses of the political crisis. At such moments all the elements of social practice, of spontaneous consciousness, and of the life of the masses and the classes are condensed and concentrated in political life. Outside of such moments, social practice splits up into discrete and even divergent areas, notably into the economic and the political. In everyday life, from that point on, the immediate and the ideological join forces to form a shell in which economic reality, the operation of the existent political superstructures, and revolutionary political consciousness are contained and concealed. Also, to reach reality, we must indeed tear away the veil, that veil which is forever being born and reborn of everyday life and which masks everyday life along with its deepest or loftiest implications. There is no reason not to quote Lenin again, the beginning the most simple, ordinary mass, immediate being, the single commodity, seen in political economy. The analysis of it as a social relation, a double analysis, deductive and inductive, logical and historical. 73. Thus the simplest event, a woman buying a pound of sugar, for example, must be analyzed. Knowledge will grasp whatever is hidden within it. To understand this simple event, it is not enough merely to describe it. Research will disclose a tangle of reasons and causes, of essences and spheres. The woman's life, her biography, her job, her family, her class, her budget, her eating habits, how she uses money, her opinions and her ideas, the state of the market, etc. Finally, I will have grasped the sum total of capitalist society, the nation, and its history. And although what I grasp becomes more and more profound, it is contained from the start in the original little event. So now I see the humble events of everyday life as having two sides, a little, individual, chance event, and at the same time an infinitely complex social event, richer than the many essences it contains within itself. The social phenomenon may be defined as the unity of these two sides. It remains for us to explain why the infinite complexity of these events is hidden, and to discover why, and this too is part of their reality, they appear to be so humble. Is it truly a question of superstructures? Is it superstructures alone that matter? No. It is a question of superstructures only insofar as they are created at each instant of everyday life and social practice, insofar as they are constantly coming down to penetrate these realms from above. And also only insofar as the superstructures are linked to society as a whole, to social practice as a whole, although everyday practice is dispersed, fragmented, be it in terms of an individual or a specific and determined social activity. In them, the whole is represented by the part, and vice versa. It is therefore not only a question of the superstructures. In truth, it is a question of sociology. In other words, of a science which studies an aspect or sector of social relations. And now the new reader or the old one who reads this book again will be able to judge for himself. Did it contain a theory of increasing alienation, based upon a fundamental naivety, and with archaic contents left over from some golden age, to put it more scientifically, from primitive community, or from direct, immediate person-to-person relationships? If it did, then the author must have expressed his thoughts badly. He believes that philosophically the process of social development involves two sides, the increasing fulfillment of man, and also an increasing alienation up to and including capitalist society, the one and the other, the one via the other. On the one hand, objectification, in other words, the more and more real objective existence of human beings, both in the human world of products and works, and in the human strengths and powers developed throughout history, and on the other hand, and equally on the increase, externalization and uprooting of the self, a split and estrangement. In capitalist society, this contradictory process, this tearing, is at its maximum. This society and the concepts which express it, for example the idea of social labor discovered by classic bourgeois economy, shed light on the march of history, the past and the future. And this is why the objective analysis of it as a totality undertaken in capital is a decisive one. 75. The ever unfinished development of the productive forces in economic terms has the philosophical implication of a new stage in human fulfillment of limitless possibilities, but the corresponding alienation here is just as all-encompassing. It encompasses life in its entirety. In capitalist society, money, the externalization of relations between human beings by means of commodities, takes on absolute power. But this is merely economic alienation. Money as fetish, objectified outside of men, functioning by itself, and as such one of the objects studied by the science called political economy. This economic alienation, though an integral part of total alienation, is but one of its aspects. Although the volume which follows contains certain quotations, let me clarify matters now by quoting some long extracts from the most important text by Marx on this question. 76. Obviously, some of Marx's observations were only valid for his own times. One may still find workers living in hovels, even in France. But it cannot be said that this is the general rule, much less a law. Vevins alienated labor. The worker becomes poorer the more wealth he produces, the more his production increases in power and extent. The worker becomes an ever cheaper commodity the more commodities he produces. The devaluation of the human world grows in direct proportion to the increase in value of the world of things. Labor not only produces commodities, it also produces itself and the workers as a commodity, and it does so in the same proportion in which it produces commodities in general. This fact simply means that the object that labor produces, its product, stands opposed to it as something alien, as a power independent of the producer. The product of labor is labor embodied and made material in an object. It is the objectification of labor. The realization of labor is its objectification. In the sphere of political economy, this realization of labor appears as a loss of reality for the worker. Objectification is loss of and bondage to the object. And appropriation as estrangement, as alienation, and Tauserung. It is the same in religion. The more man puts into God, the less he retains within himself. The worker places his life in the object, but now it no longer belongs to him, but to the object. What the product of his labor is, he is not. The externalization and Tauserung of the worker in his product means not only that his labor becomes an object and external existence, but that it exists outside him, independently of him and alien to him, and confronts him as an autonomous power. That the life which he has bestowed on the object confronts him as hostile and alien. Political economy conceals the estrangement in the nature of labor by ignoring the direct relationship between the worker, labor, and production. It is true that labor produces marvels for the rich, but it produces privation for the worker. It produces palaces, but hovels for the worker. It produces intelligence, but it produces idiocy and cretinism for the worker. After all, the product is simply the resume of the activity, of the production. So if the product of labor is alienation, production itself must be active alienation, the alienation of activity, the activity of alienation. The estrangement of the object of labor merely summarizes the estrangement, the alienation in the activity of labor itself. What constitutes the alienation of labor? Firstly, the fact that labor is external to the worker, i.e. does not belong to his essential being. That he therefore does not confirm himself in his work, but denies himself, feels miserable and not happy. Hence the worker feels himself only when he is not working. When he is working, he does not feel himself. He is at home when he is not working, and not at home when he is working. His labor is therefore not the satisfaction of a need, but a mere means to satisfy needs outside itself. Just as in religion, the spontaneous activity of the human imagination, the human brain and the human heart detaches itself from the individual and reappears as the alien activity of a god or of a devil. So the activity of the worker is not his own spontaneous activity. It belongs to another, it is a loss of his self. The result is that man, the worker, feels that he is acting freely only in his animal functions, eating, drinking, and procreating, or at most in his dwelling and adornment, while in his human functions he is nothing more than an animal. It is true that eating, drinking, and procreating, etc. are also genuine human functions. However, when abstracted from our other aspects of human activity and turned into final and exclusive ends, they are animal. This relationship is the relationship of the worker to his own activity. As something which is alien and does not belong to him, activity as passivity, Leiden, power as impotence, procreation as emasculation, the worker's own physical and mental energy, his personal life for what is life but activity, as an activity directed against himself, which is independent of him and does not belong to him. Self-estrangement, as compared with the estrangement of the object, sachet, mentioned above. Nature is man's inorganic body, that is to say nature insofar as it is not the human body. Man lives from nature, i.e. nature is his body, and he must maintain a continuing dialogue with it if he is not to die. To say that man's physical and mental life is linked to nature simply means that nature is linked to itself, for man is a part of nature. Estranged labor not only one estranges nature from man and two, estranges man from himself. It also estranges man from his species. It turns his species, life into a means for his individual life. Firstly, it estranges life, species, and individual life, and secondly, it turns the latter in its abstract form into the purpose of the former also in its abstract and estranged form. For in the first place, labor, life activity, productive life itself appears to man only as a means for the satisfaction of a need, the need to preserve physical existence. But productive life is species, life. It is life, producing life. The whole character of a species, its species, character, resides in the nature of its life activity, and free conscious activity constitutes the species character of man. Life itself appears only as a means of life. The animal is immediately one with its life activity. It is not distinct from that activity, it is that activity. Man makes his life activity itself an object of his will and consciousness. He has conscious life activity. It is not a determination with which he directly merges. Conscious life activity directly distinguishes man from animal life activity. Only because of that is he a species being. Or rather, he is a conscious being, i.e., his own life is an object for him. Only because he is a species being. Only because of that is his activity-free activity. Estranged labor reverses the relationships of that man. Just because he is a conscious being makes his life activity his being, Wesson, a mere means for his existence. It is true that animals also produce, but they produce one-sidedly, while man produces universally. They produce only when immediate physical need compels them to do so. While man is capable of producing according to the standards of every species, hence man also produces in accordance with the laws of beauty. It is therefore in the fashioning of the objective that man really proves himself to be a species being. Such production is his active species, life. Through it nature appears as his work and his reality. The object of labor is therefore the objectification of the species, life of man, for man reproduces himself not only intellectually in his consciousness, but actively and actually, and he can therefore contemplate himself in a world he himself has created. In tearing away the object of his production from man, estranged labor therefore tears away from him his species, life, his true species, objectivity, and transforms his advantage over animals into the disadvantage that his inorganic body nature is taken from him. An immediate consequence of man's estrangement from the product of his labor, his life activity, his species being, is the estrangement of man from man. When man confronts himself, he also confronts other men. In general, the proposition that man is estranged from his species being means that each man is estranged from the others, and that all are estranged from man's essence. The alien being to whom labor and the product of labor belong can be none other than man himself, a man other than the worker. Thus Marx does not limit alienation to exploitation, to the fact that a share of the product is taken away from the worker individually or collectively, the working class, by the individual and the class which controls the means of production. He analyzes alienation under several headings. The alienation of the worker as an object, the alien power which turns him into an object. B. The alienation of productive activity. In other words, of labor itself, which is divided and split up by it. C. The alienation of man as species being member of the human species as a system of humanized species needs. D. The alienation of man as a being of nature, as a set of natural needs. A little farther on in other texts, Marx introduces some new elements. The machine accommodates itself to man's weakness in order to turn weak man into a machine. 77 or again. The division of labor is the economic expression of the social nature of labor within estrangement. 78 and again. Just as society itself produces man as man, so it is produced by him. The human essence of nature exists only for social man. 72. Each attempts to establish over the other an alien power, in the hope of thereby achieving satisfaction of his own selfish needs. 80 estrangement appears not only in the fact that the means of my life belong to another, but also in the fact that my desire is the inaccessible possession of another, and also in the fact that all things are other than themselves, that my activity is other than itself, and that finally, and this goes for the capitalist too, an inhuman power rules over everything. 81 These texts make the polyscopic omnipresent character of alienation as a concept, a reality and philosophical theory linked to the social sciences, more than abundantly clear. And this is much in regard to productive forces and social relations as in regard to ideology, and even more profoundly in regard to man's relation with nature and with his own nature. The main quotation from Estranged Labor shows that for Marx's work constitutes man's essence. As a creator, a being of needs who creates his own needs, and it is precisely work that alienation humiliates, atomizes, overpowers. The theory of impoverishment is an integral part of Marx's theory of alienation, and yet the two concepts are discrete. Thus the facts relating to them must be studied separately, the latter being a more extensive area than the former. Therefore, if one emphasizes the idea of alienation, it means that one does not reject a priori the theory of the tendency towards impoverishment. The economic laws formulated by Marx always deal with tendencies, and are thwarted by other forces, other activities, and other laws. As long as it is not backed up by scientific analyses of the life and the needs of the proletariat compared by region, type of industry, and country, the analysis of impoverishment, like the analysis of alienation, is just so much hot air. A priori it is probable that here, as elsewhere, differences in development play an important role. It is becoming essential to undertake not only an economic analysis, but also a sociological one, dealing with basic or differentiated needs, the degrees and the structures of those needs, be they old or new, hidden or unsatisfied, etc. There are other texts by Marx which show clearly that in his view the crowning element in the inhuman power which reigns over all social life is the state. It consolidates that power and sanctions it. In one sense, political alienation, with the political superstition by which the state is actually endowed with a life superior to the life of society, is the most serious type of alienation. In another sense, it also determines the sphere in which the struggle against alienation, disalienation, and radical criticism, its auxiliary, will be most effective, most necessary, and most directly possible. It is equally clear that Marx sees the division of labor as the cause of alienation. Now, he never suggested that the political revolution on the level of the superstructures, nor socialism on the level of the relations of production could bring an end to the division of labor. He merely imagined that after a transitional period of unspecified length, communism could supersede the division of labor. During this transition, the forms of alienation, the law for example, and of course the division of labor would carry on. Therefore, Marx never limited the sphere of alienation to capitalism, and never did he suggest that socialism or the proletarian revolution would bring alienation to an absolute and immediate end. 82 Alienation persists, or is even born again in new forms, along with its contradictory process, the process of disalienation. But here we are broaching new problems which go beyond our immediate concerns and maybe beyond the concerns of the book itself. For these are philosophical problems. The philosopher may well go so far as to ask himself whether all realization, all objectification, does not involve an alienation as its own deep-seated negativity. And so there is still more to be said about the theory of alienation. But before we proceed, we should clear up a difficulty which is linked to this theory, but distinct from it. A letter the author received shortly after the book was published said, "You demonstrate an analogy between acting, theater, and life. You emphasize the importance of mask and character. But what about the new man? Doesn't he supersede the opposition between acting and being serious? In my opinion, he no longer wears a mask for other people, not even the mask of irony. Oh, how wonderfully optimistic we were after the liberation. It was 0 hour for history. The man of old was disappearing. The new man was bursting forth in all his beauty and undeniable authenticity. What has become of this beautiful and naive image, and this beautiful and naive confidence? The new man, the new life, these were the images, the hopes, the myths at the moment of the liberation, replacing the myth which had inspired the struggle in October 1917. The almost immediate transition to communism. Significantly, the hope of the liberation focused itself on everyday life and expressed the need to make a break which we have encountered at the microscopic level of day-to-day worries and preoccupations at the level of society. Indeed, we could ask ourselves why this naive expectation expressed itself as it did on the ethical level, and why it found it so easy to abandon the aesthetic level, where masks and acting are not considered necessarily bad. Would there still be theater and art if there was no longer any theater in real life? And if personalities no longer put on their act, for themselves and for other people? The naive belief that the new was at hand made it easy to sacrifice the aesthetic for the ethical. For better and for worse, this expectation of an absolute ethical authenticity was completely disappointed, a misfortune from which aesthetics came out very well, proving that the best things come to those who wait. Events have surpassed even Shakespeare for buffoonery and tragedy. History has gone even farther than the trials in Brecht's plays. What theatrical production could compete with the Raj trials? What stage effect could rival the Khrushchev report? 83 What mask, what character in fiction could compare with Stalin's? The new man was not completely absent from this book. However, he only appeared in the conceptual and philosophical shape of the total man, entirely developed, entirely won back from alienation. In my critique of everyday life, I was wary of bringing this concept too closely into confrontation with given everyday life. The philosopher's vocation is such that he is almost entirely and almost always above the naivety of the passing moment. The new man, the communist man, the total man. It would have been only too easy to confuse these terms. And in fact, we have seen people who excel at sticking what they consider to be appropriate labels on others sharing these titles out amongst themselves. For all their assaults on huge historical truths, such dogmatists insist that they are world historical men, contemporaries of the future. Because they are communists in the mid-20th century, they see themselves as members of the communist society of the future, with all the qualities of the communist man, sometimes. In fits of critical and autocritical sincerity or self-deception, they reproach themselves for not having these qualities, and beneath the seriousness of their masks, a set of new comic characters is born. The concept of the total man comes from some brief comments Marx made, notably this one. Man appropriates his integral essence in an integral way as a total man. 84. In this brief phrase, Marx limits himself to defining the philosophical problem of universality as a function of human development and of another fundamental concept, that of appropriation. This means that his observation would need to be much elucidated and developed before being treated as a genuine philosophical theory. 85. It is particularly important to note that the famous theory of the leap from necessity into freedom offers an all too easy justification for the new strain of utopianism and idealism we have briefly outlined above. This theory tends to support the great modern myth of the revolution as total act, radical break, absolute renewal. It is therefore appropriate to emphasize that the shift from necessity to freedom and from alienation to fulfillment requires a lengthy period of transition. What the classic Marxist theorists have somewhat laconically called a leap occupies a vast period in history and implies the resolution of numerous problems and contradictions. The end of non-human history and the beginning of human history inform a process of becoming in which elements of discontinuity and continuity, a multitude of factors on the decline or on the rise, and complex quantitative questions are all interwoven. The classic account based on quantity and quality is too simple, as if in reality everything could always be reduced to a confrontation between quantity and quality. The transitional man cannot be avoided, and the transition is evident all around us, as much in capitalist society, and the reader is directed to the final pages of imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism as in socialist society. It is impossible to cross over this period in a single bound. The critique of everyday life analyses life as it is, without making an obscure entity of it. It studies the negative and positive elements which confront one another. It studies the new conflicts and the new contradictions in what is new, knowing that the new is, more or less, everywhere. Thus it knows that the new man must resolve his own contradictions in order to develop as a man. Man and the human have always constituted a whole, in and through contradictions, i.e. alienations. As for the total man, universal, concrete, and alive, he can only be conceived of as a limit to the infinity of social development. To what extent do the stages of transition fall into the philosophical category of alienation? Merely to ask the question shows that interest is shifting towards transition and man in transition, but insofar as he is moving towards the total man. In other words, crossing through alienation, and perhaps alienation at its maximum, the transitional man is disalienating himself. So we can keep our philosophical concepts, as long as we make them concrete and see them historically and sociologically, thus extending the developments undertaken by Marx, who concretized the initially philosophical concept of alienation by situating it in economic objects. This obliges us to search documents and works, literary, cinematic, etc., for evidence that a consciousness of alienation is being born, however indirectly, and that an effort towards disalienation, no matter how oblique and obscure, has begun. For the era of transition should be the one in which the philosophical concept enters life and consciousness, whether spontaneously or introduced from outside. Otherwise, that concept will remain philosophical and nothing more. In any event, it is very important for the critique of everyday life to know, and to know that the masses know that the transcendence of the internal splits and contradictions in the human realm, intellectual versus manual work, town versus country, private versus social, can no more be reduced to a simple act, to some decisive and total moment than revolution itself. The total man is but a figure on a distant horizon beyond our present vision. He is a limit, an idea, and not a historical fact. And yet we must historicize the notion, thinking of it historically and socially, and not naively, like those who believe that the new man would suddenly burst forth into history complete, and in possession of all the hitherto incompatible qualities of vitality and lucidity, of humble determination in labor and limitless enthusiasm in creation. However, the dialectic of knowledge shows us a historicity and becoming united with universality. All historically acquired knowledge is approximate, reversible, provisional, relative, and yet only the notion of the absolute gives this partial, divided, contradictory knowledge a meaning. The absolute is present in the relative, and the relative in the absolute, in a dual way. On the one hand, the absolute is in the relative as we receive it historically. Every piece of knowledge, every concept, every proposition, every statement, contains a grain of truth which can only become clear in the context of an ongoing evolutionary process. Though an integral part of this process, it will retain a degree of invariability even as the contradictions imminent to historical development are successively confronted and resolved. On the other hand, the absolute is outside of the relative. This is the idea that there will be a completion of knowledge, a fulfillment which is impossible and yet implied by the total becoming of knowledge, therefore placing a limit to infinity, the asymptote of the total process. Dialectically, the absolute is a limit to the infinity of the relative, and yet there is already something of the absolute in the relative. In all limited, contradictory, and subjective knowledge, there is already element of total objectivity. Only the notion or idea of the absolute gives a sense, in other words, both a meaning and a direction, to historically acquired knowledge. Only the materialist dialectic enables us to demonstrate the historical character of knowledge without making it entirely relative. Only the dialectic will enable us to define and advance a progress, while at the same time criticizing the illusions which arise whenever progress is made, and which cause us to take every step forward, every discovery, every new law or theory for the finished form of some particular sector of knowledge. This is another gnosiological underpinning of the dogmatic approach. It is the same for the human. Either one thinks philosophically in order to found humanism, or else one neglects and rejects such an intellectual development, thus abandoning humanism to contingency and chance. Human advance and progress only take their sense, in other words, both their meaning and their direction, from the notion of the total man. Every moment of history, every stage accomplished through history, constitutes a whole, so does every partial activity, every power which has been achieved practically. Every moment also contains its grain of human reality which will appear more and more clearly during the subsequent process of development. At the same time, the total man is a limit to infinity. Only if we posit this limit as a universality can we assert that, despite the conflicts and the contradictions, there is a profound if still unrealized unity between domains of activity, poetry and science, art and knowledge, etc. Just as learning without the idea of the absolute falls into pure relativism, so without the notion of the total man, humanism and the theoretical conception of the human fall back into an incoherent pluralism. Thus, the theory of the fundamental is and is not in history. It integrates history and integrates with history in a coherent dialectical way. Is this theory Hegelian or neo-Hegelian? Let us look at it more closely. It is certain that for Hegel, the absolute foundation of existence, of history, of the dialectic, was the alienation of the idea. In his system, this alienation is the initial and absolute condition for development. The idea leaves itself, becomes alienated, the dispersed other itself a constantly alienated existence, incapable of apprehending itself without entering into opposition with itself. The ascending stages of being, nature, mechanism, society, art, religion, philosophy, establish themselves by the idea successively regaining control over itself. None of these stages, none of these shapings or configurations of consciousness, succeeds in being its own truth in itself and for itself. They thus remain in the domain of alienation. In Hegel then, contradiction is nothing more than an implication of alienation. To know and to understand oneself, to reflect upon oneself, is to resolve contradictions while provoking new alienating contradictions. 86. The idea is at once the motive force of contradiction and its outcome. It is both that which opposes itself and that which uses contradiction to rediscover and to recognize through reflection its unity with itself. The movement of logic appears to reconstruct the universe. In fact, it rediscovers and recognizes the descending and ascending emanations of the idea. The being which seems the absolute beginning of the real and of reflection of consciousness is in truth only the absolute limit of the idea, at once inferior and superior, from below and from above, from the side of nature, feelings, abstraction, and from the side of spirit. Thus logic, which in Hegel appears at first to produce the world, is in truth only the human method for attaining the idea, which is why it can rid itself of the idea and the absolute in the Hegelian sense, and change course so as to enter Marxism. And yet in Hegel, the absolute tearing apart of the idea, its alienation, is indispensable if this idea is to create self-consciousness, and to become conscious of itself as it creates, by means of its reflection, in which it is reflected. Hegelianism likewise views the tearing apart of reality, of life, of consciousness, and its unhappiness, as irreducibly given. 87. By abandoning the concrete analysis of these divisions, these separations, the tearing apart of actions and consciousness which are the real facts of real life, certain of Hegel's exponents have ended up in mysticism. They maintain that the tearing apart is an absolute drama, a drama within the absolute. In their view, human actions illustrate this absolute drama and can only be understood in terms of its image. Post-Hegelian mysticism develops the vision of the speculative Good Friday. It starts with the hypothesis that Hegel developed a new series of concepts in order to rationalize the irrational, that he succeeded up to a point, but that beyond that point he failed, thus authorizing them to resume the task from where he left off, precisely by giving prominence to the mystical essence of the residue of irrationality. Yet it is also possible to show that in Hegel, and this even in his system building, there was an attempt to enclose totality within the reflecting individual, and that for him this attempt involved an explicit struggle against mysticism. For this is the sense and the goal of the Hegelian system, to allow an individual, the philosopher and his followers, to dominate the universe by thought. And the system is also the justification for this goal, the history of this individual. Marx extended Hegel's contradictory attempt to rationalize, resolving its contradiction and breaking his system while at the same time retaining its element of rationality. Marx has demonstrated how dialectical reason arises precisely from the supposed irrationality constituted by nature, by practical and social activity, by man as he is in everyday life. It is thus that the residue of irrationality in Hegel, the theory of alienation, becomes integrated within historical and dialectical materialism, and is transferred onto a level which is both practical and rational. In Marxism, alienation is no longer the absolute foundation of contradiction. On the contrary, alienation is defined as an aspect of contradiction and of becoming in man. Alienation is the form taken by dialectical necessity in human becoming. Thus Hegel explains contradiction by alienation, while Marx explains alienation by dialectical contradiction. This is what the well-known reversal whereby the Hegelian dialectic has been set back on its feet consists of. This transformation does not exclude the theory of alienation, it encompasses it. Feuerbach thought he had brought human alienation to an end in one fell swoop, by a radical and total philosophical act or decree. He proclaimed that theology, religion, metaphysics are all alienations of man, and no longer of the idea, but by defining man once and for all as an individual physiological entity. By rejecting the dialectic and the historicity of the human, he was destroying the foundation for a concrete theory of alienation. And he was also admitting the bourgeois individual as an anthropological principle as an unconsidered presupposition. Marx rejects the form taken by Feuerbach's materialism, his anthropological postulate. He does not think that man as such is a simple fragment of nature. But on the other hand, he rejects the idealist postulate that thinking man emerges from nature and sets himself up above it by virtue of his thought, of the mere fact that he thinks. In this way he succeeds in superseding previous philosophies, the picture of man they presented and the relation they defined between man and the universe. Marx wants to think of man's essence dialectically. For him man is a being of nature in the process of self-transcendence, a being of nature struggling with nature in order to dominate it, a being emerging from nature, but doing so in such a way that in the very process of emerging from and dominating nature its roots are plunged ever more deeply therein. In the prehistory of man, therefore up until the present, man was first of all a being of nature. Now in material and biological nature, becoming appears as fragmentation, dispersion, externalization, exclusion and reciprocal destruction. The natural other being is essentially the enemy being. In this prehistory, which was his natural history, man was precisely that. But insofar as he was a social being, he was already becoming something else, in such a way that in his natural history nature within him was the profound reason and ever-present cause for his alienation, constantly renewed, for his internal contradiction. This history of humanity presents us with a collection of strange facts and events. Institutions and ideas were external to the human, oppressive, exclusive, mutually contradictory. They were mutually destructive, and it was necessary to destroy them if they were to be superseded. And yet these institutions and these ideas were the indispensable expression of the development and the acquisition of human practice, and human powers essential in order to organize and formulate these and to render them conscious. None of this contradiction is at the heart of Marxist thought as far as the historical development of man is concerned. But it is not contradiction in Marxist thought itself. 88 It is an internal contradiction in history itself, and only the general theory of alienation can elucidate it. It alone can help us to understand how men constructed history while being caught within history, within their own history, and how they constructed it without knowing they were doing so, blindly at first, but more and more consciously, on several differing but convergent levels, economic, political and ideological struggles, and how finally revolt and violence and chance were only apparently an irrational and absurd factor in history. Things progress, in other words certain things disappear, with their bad side forward. This tearing apart shows that in the growing control that man has over nature, nature as such keeps control over man. His products and his works function like beings of nature. He must objectify himself, and social objects become things fetishes which turn upon him. Man as a collective subject exists after the fashion of nature, yet man tends to supersede nature and to build a specific environment in which contradiction in its natural form, spontaneous, blind, necessary, will itself be superseded, controlled, known and mastered. The moment man invented tools and began to work he stopped being an animal, and entered the realm of historical and human contradictions. But these contradictions extend the contradictions of nature, and particularly in their necessary, blind aspect. If man has humanized himself, he has done so only by tearing himself apart, dividing himself, fragmenting himself. Actions and products, powers and fetishes, growing consciousness and spontaneous lack of consciousness, organization and revolt. Defined alienation may be philosophically as the single yet dual movement of objectification and externalization of realization and derealization. But this movement must be seen in its dialectical profundity. That which realizes is also that which derealizes. And vice versa. Whatever derealizes, dissolves, destroys, negates, also realizes by supersession. Obstacles. Uncomfortable difficulties, disquiet, apparently insoluble problems, contradiction pushed to the point of antagonism, these are moments of progress. The step forward, the birth of reality, and a higher reflecting consciousness through the dissolution of what exists. The positive is negative, but what is most negative is also what is most positive, and this becoming may be expressed in a way which is all the more striking for being concrete, practical, and alive, as the discreteness yet inclusiveness of the individual and the social. 89 This unity is the foundation of all society. A society is made up of individuals, and the individual is a social being in and by the content of his life and the form of his consciousness. Now from the direct and physical rituals of primitive societies to the lived abstraction of self-consciousness. Private consciousness. This unity has only expressed itself in mutilated, fragmented, singular ways. It cannot be expressed outside of the contradictions which have ensnared it, splitting it and making it problematic, unstable, destined to be superseded. The social, foreign in the individual, is always embodied in rituals, in particular words or expressions, 90% which are full of meaning and at the same time relatively meaningless in themselves, thus insignificant and symbolic, according to the moment and the angle from which we perceive him. The individual is at one and the same time what is most highly concrete and most remotely abstract. He is what is most changing historically and what is most stable, what is most independent from the social structure, and most dependent upon it. Conversely, the social is abstract, since it is defined only by the individuals who make it up, and it is what is most supremely concrete, since it gives these individual existences their unity, their totality, and since it determines the content of their lives and their consciousness. For each individual, the unity of his consciousness and unity with his consciousness is his reality, and the rest is mere destiny, externality, necessity. However, from the point of view of its foundation and social content, the very unity of the most intimate individual consciousness is determined from outside. Thus, what is most internal is also what is most external. Private consciousness, for example. And conversely, what is most external is what is most internal. The sense of a value, for example. Past ideologies try to find answers to some very diverse questions and problems, to offer solutions to a multitude of contradictions, but most of all they address the problem of and the contradiction between individual and social. They recreated it in new forms, deeper and more hopeless, until such time as these were eliminated by violence or by gradual erosion, in the name of a new social content. Thus religions, theological or metaphysical projects, were authentic attempts to reconcile man with himself, the human with nature, the individual with the social. They achieved both their internal coherence and their entry into life from these attempts in the form of actions and the search for a style. Religious fervor and belief in a God gave symbolic expression to the unity of the elements of the human, and projected this unity outside man. In fact, however, at the very moment ideology was creating this unity by becoming a coherent doctrine and discovering a style of living, it was also perpetuating the inner division in the form of good and evil, sin and salvation, God and the devil. Religion as institution maintained a social unity by separating the sacred and the profane and by oppression. As for direct or indirect communion with nature, ecstatic contemplation, for the oppressed and even for a proportion of their oppressors, was merely a diversion. The intensity of the mystical states attained was an index of nothing but real powerlessness, and an absence of any creative appropriation. As soon as the unity between the individual and the social begins a process of renewal, alienation takes the form of an antagonism between the private consciousness and the social consciousness. In modern society, the self-same alienation has taken other forms. Every time it is possible to proclaim the externality of the whole and of the part, either that the part is superior to the whole, or that the whole transcends the part, there is always an ideologue on hand to do the job. And the resultant ideology is always influential. Machines for machines' sake, or conversely man versus machine. Reason for reason's sake, or conversely art reduced to a mere utilitarian technique, etc. Man's unity with himself, in particular the unity of the individual and the social, is an essential aspect of the definition of the total man. In these circumstances, we must either abandon trying to formulate a coherent theory and proclaim pluralism, which is simply the expression of this abandonment, or instead construct a system of categories which will grasp nature and man at the same time, in their movement, in their contradiction, and in their interpenetration. Before dialectical materialism, every system, which wanted to be total, which wanted to be philosophical, thus systematic and coherent, merely used unconscious social categories to grasp the universe. For the philosopher, for the ideologue in general, society was a given accepted naively along with its content, and in the ideological forms it had adopted at the spontaneously moment the thinker started to reflect. In other words, he accepted it together with its profoundest assumptions. Thus Plato accepted slavery, Descartes and Spinoza accepted commerce and mercantile capitalism, and Hegel accepted the bourgeois individual. So in these doctrines, and in their search for internal coherence, there was a radical duplicity, more often than not concealed by sophistry or mysticism, thoughts based on unconsidered data presuppositions. And certainly throughout the history of philosophy we can see the ambiguous and contradictory pathways which in the 18th century crystallized as materialism and idealism. But that is just one aspect of the history of ideologies and philosophies in relation to the development of history and society. In our view, past philosophies and their history on the one hand, and Marxist philosophical thought on the other, cannot be reduced to a few glibly systematized observations on matter and spirit. They are richer and more complex than that. The elaboration of categories constitutes another aspect of the development, one which has its own complexities. For the categories had practical, historical, and social origins. At the same time, they underwent a theoretical elaboration aimed at formulating and defining them, and determining the connections between them. Specifically, philosophical categories can only be separated from social categories a posteriori, in the wake of Marx, in a contribution to the critique of political economy. We have already noted the importance of the objectivity of the categories by which bourgeois society expresses itself in its criticism of previous socio-economic structures. For example, the category of social labor. At a certain stage in its development, society began to examine critically the categories which expressed it. This was when Marx inaugurated, as a function of bourgeois society seen in its becoming and its totality, and therefore as a function of the existence of the working class, the critique of the categories of bourgeois society itself. Thus Marx defined the bourgeois nature of the individual, which hitherto had been taken as an absolute. For Marx, the category of social labor discovered by the classic economists became that of alienated. Labor need was revealed as alienated need. It was through critical reflection that the fetishistic character of commodities and money was arrived at. In this way, a higher and decisive stage in objectivity was reached. Once the origins of these categories were made conscious, it became feasible to represent the universe and history coherently, and in a way which really allowed the elements of the human their unity. In a way in which society and the human were consequently no longer in opposition, but integrated in a whole, each retaining its specificity. If this unity is to be fully developed, a painstaking and extensive critical analysis of the categories in every sphere of art and science will therefore be needed. In philosophy as well. This immense undertaking will provide us with a better grasp of what is still only abstract, and will enable us to introduce what is still only theoretical and ideological into everyday life and consciousness. Marx merely set this task in motion, notably in the contribution to the critique of political economy, the importance of which is often totally neglected in favor either of his earlier writings or else of Capital. His work is a model, a guide, a beacon. In no respect is it a completed system, a vision or a conception of the world in the traditional meaning of the terms. At the same time, this examination of categories and the elaboration of their relations and of their theoretical unity constitutes a critique of superseded ideologies. Their concepts and categories, notably of those ideologies that sanction the directly experienced discreteness of the individual and the social, their real contradiction, by hypostasizing it in the form of an imagined discreteness which puts all the stress either on the one or on the other, or the profound Hegelian distinction between understanding intelligence and reason takes on a new meaning. Understanding must be defined as a historical and theoretical stage in thought and consciousness. It analyses, separates, and situates determinations in reciprocal externality. It determines properties and relations in isolation. It undergoes determinations. It accepts them according to a given culture, a given society with its class struggles and its social structure and its oppressive institutions. It seeks unsuccessfully to work out a coherent, logical discourse on the universe. Dialectical understanding reason criticizes and dispels its determinants, but only better to grasp the unity behind its contradictions. It understands categories in their real historical development and their connections. It is defined by the critical movement of these categories. It the function of the universal and of the totality operating through negation and through contradictions that are known and dominated. It relativizes categories in order to grasp the universal within them more surely. At the same time, whereas understanding always hopes to close and conclude its discourse on the universe, dialectical reason knows that its work can never be completed. The notion of alienation may be grasped on the level of understanding, and that is the level in which we all receive it and grasp it initially, then try to conceptualize and apply it. But the problem is to move to the highest level of dialectical reason, to think the notion dialectically, in a universal and concrete way, in other words, by determining it in all the breadth of its universality, and by grasping it in the minutiae of everyday life. Moreover, the effort of the philosopher does not and cannot stay on an isolated philosophical level, in a separate consciousness, sphere, or dimension. The source of his theories is social practice, and he must direct them back towards life, be it through his teaching or by other means. Poetry, literature, dialectical thought can and must transform itself into dialectical consciousness of life, in life, unity of the immediate and the immediate of the abstract, and the concrete, of culture and natural spontaneity. In this way it will pass from ideology and specific knowledge into culture, language, perhaps into direct perception of the world in any event, into everyday life. Conclusion. The theory of alienation and of the total man remain the driving force behind the critique of everyday life. They allow us to represent social development as a whole and to determine the direction in which it is going. They also allow us to analyze this becoming, boring down within it for samples, penetrating its details and linking it with the overall system. These notions must be handled with extreme caution, however. We cannot give them an ontological meaning like the concepts in use in traditional philosophy. To use them inconsiderately, speculatively, is extremely hazardous. For example, an idea which expresses all the parts of the process and its limit to infinity can become an image of the future, or, even worse, an already accomplished reality. There is a perfunctory kind of Marxism which believes itself capable of seeing into the future or of asserting that the present, a given individual man in particular conditions, such as socialist society or militant action future, represents the. And yet non-Marxist philosophers, psychologists, and sociologists carry out exactly the same operation, even though they do so, apparently, in a more abstract way. They declare that man, or the human, or the social, or the historical, make up a whole. At the same time, they declare that this totality is already with us, present, describable, and fully graspable. They use the category of totality, a philosophical category, in a non-critical manner. They use it non-dialectically, in a way that is both logical and speculative. Thus, investigations which ought to be pursued coherently using the category dialectically end up at sixes and sevens, pulling in different directions, representing themselves as opposing systems. Sometimes man and the human appear to be wandering aimlessly and endlessly through history. History and everyday life appear complex, but ambiguous, at the mercy of radical contingency and pure relativism. The concrete face of freedom is reduced to the minuscule dimensions of individual choice, and disappears as far as the meaning of history is concerned. At other times history is given a goal and personality and meaning according to a traditional theology. God and religion are the foundation of totality, of total life. And at other times again the hypothesis that totality is effectively present is used to certify its absence, and so it becomes a question of detotalized totality, something which emphasizes splitting and breaking, separation and the tragic, as a way of consecrating them. 91 Thus, when taken in isolation, in other words speculatively, outside of praxis, the theories of alienation and totality become transformed into systems which are very remote from Marxism, into neo-Hegelianism. The operation which consists of leaving social practice and its analysis in order to engage in speculation, only to come back to reality armed with a pseudo-concept, leads to a variety of contradictory representations. Their externality creates an illusion, and makes us believe in the richness of philosophy, whereas what we have before us is the image of its incoherence, its powerlessness, its poverty. Another aspect of the question. Taken in isolation, non-dialectically, the concept of alienation is open to strictly individual manipulation. Anyone at all can take it over and declare that such an activity alienates and externalizes him, and turns him into a thing, work, for example, or a profession, or love, marriage, children. There may be an element of truth in this, but the person concerned will use this partial truth to construct exaggerations, superfluities, disturbing interpretations. From this false point of view, it is no longer consciousness which is alienated. It is consciousness which does the alienating. And the first schoolboy who comes along will be able to say that the way he is taught at school, especially if he really is being badly taught, and the work he has to do, they are turning him into a thing. In the same way, it will no longer be a particular type of work which is alienating, or social labor which is alienated, but work in general which will appear alienating. And the theory of everyday life, together with its critique, will be metamorphosed into a philosophy of idleness. Thus, this difficult and rigorous theory can become a principle of facilness. The implement for a positive critique becomes the implement for hypercriticism, for entirely negative pseudo-criticism. What form of life, what partial content is there which could not be taken as being totally alienating? Not only religion, but love too. Every form of art, not simply purely abstract art, or art for art's sake, not only state oppression, but any discipline within society, not only the private man, but the citizen, not only the systematic disordering of the senses, 92, but knowledge itself. Thus, all self-realization, which can only be partial and must therefore involve alienation at a more or less deep level, appears to be and becomes total alienation. Thus, in recent years, the theory of alienation has become widely available in a form which is both speculative and arbitrary. This is above all because in this guise it permits the free and empty affirmation of the self, in other words, a return to the bourgeois individual, as well as to pessimism, to individualism. But despite appearances, we are still within the parameters of neo-Hegelianism. I say despite appearances because this interpretation does conflict with the political and state-controlled claim that only by political action and activity on the level of the state can alienation be avoided, the human realized and the individual humanized. The fact is that the two interpretations, individualist or political, anarchistic or state-centered, are interdependent. The one relies on the other, the one justifies the other, and neither goes beyond the Hegelian framework. Thus, of necessity, theory and concepts, such as alienation, totality, the total man, become meeting points and areas of discussion for divergent doctrines, and an excuse for polemics. On the theoretical and ideological level, it is a situation which calls for extra vigilance. We have reached the core of the problems of our era, the core of all our problems. The danger is that we may use philosophical concepts and categories speculatively. But how can we determine how to use them legitimately? Marx gives us the example and the model. In his writings, the theory and the concept of alienation are integrated into the development of his thought while retaining their philosophical meaning. They become transformed. Though no longer discernible as such in economic science, they nevertheless constitute its basis and its philosophical meaning. The theory of alienation becomes transformed into the theory of fetishism. Fetishism of commodities, money, capital. Social relations are enclosed and concealed within these economic objects, which are also objects of political economy. Taking on the appearance of things, the products of social activity in effect become things invested with power over men. In my opinion, in his early writings, particularly in the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, Marx had not yet fully developed his thought. It is there, however, germinating, growing, becoming. Certainly, the interpretation of these texts is problematic, but the problems need to be properly formulated. My view is that historical and dialectical materialism developed. It did not come into being abruptly, with an absolute discontinuity, after a break, at X moment, in the works of Marx, and in the history of humanity. And to think that it did produces false problems. To begin with, Marxism is made to appear like a system, a dogma. This is not to challenge the newness of Marxism. On the contrary, it represents it in a more profound manner. Any radical newness must be born, must grow and take shape, precisely because it is a new reality. A brutal break is highly unlikely to produce something with genuine life. Rather, it creates a pure, abstract idea, or dogmatic decree. The thesis, which puts a date on Marxism, or tries to, seriously runs the risk of desiccating it, and of interpreting it in a one-sided way. What is more, how can Marxism be envisaged outside of its own categories, becoming, development? This would be to enclose it in a contradiction. Or worse, to represent it as external to the reality for which it provides the key, to apply it from outside, dogmatically. Have there these problems philosophical side. They involve exegesis, scholarly apparatus, but they also contribute to living research. It cannot be simply a matter of confronting text with text. The text living reality. Therefore, there's generally no ready-made solution to the problems presented. Or else the problem presented is not the real one, but a prefabricated dogmatic schematization. The mistake, the false option which must be avoided, is to overestimate or else to underestimate Marx's early writings. They already contain Marxism, but as a potential, and certainly not all Marxism, a term which in any case has no clearly defined meaning. It is false, and anti-dialectical, and anti-Marxist, to consider that Marx's thought was born like Minerva springing forth from the head of Jupiter, and it is absurd to consider that Marxism begins with a manifesto or capital. The early writings contain great riches, but riches still confused, riches half-mined and scarcely exploited. That Marx should subsequently abandon or transform such philosophical concepts as alienation does not prove them to be meaningless, nor does the advent of political economy mean that the role of philosophy is at an end. We may take them up again and use them, as Marx did, to criticize their social origins and speculative interpretations of them. What is more, Marx shows us the dangers of using them metaphysically. He integrates them within a specific science, political economy. Thus, the problem is as follows. There is more to capital than political economy. It contains history. It contains deep insights into sociology, notably the fundamental concept of socio-economic formation. Are we really betraying Marx's work if we integrate the concept of alienation into a sociology which has been explicitly constituted as a science? Certainly, it is not clear what use the concept of alienation can have for the historian, but in fact that proves nothing. Maybe historians will have something to say about this, and they are perfectly entitled to do so. The same question goes for psychologists and psychiatrists. But if we can form a clear idea of the use the sociologist may make of the concept, then we can legitimately conclude that such a use follows the fundamental tendencies of Marxist thought. Let us make an even more general point. The content of concrete life has produced forms which conflict with it, smother it, and which consequently collapse from the self-inflicted lack of substance and roots. The separation of form and content does not date from today or yesterday. It turns up in most ideological mystifications. And it produces an error which dialectical thought must carefully avoid. The danger in separating form and content is that their unity will be forgotten. There is no form without content, no content without form. It is impossible to grasp a content as such without giving it a form, or without using an existing form as a starting point, in order to come to grips analytically with its content. Any separation of form and content involves a certain amount of illusion and superficiality. For form it means not an absence or formal purity, but rather a loss of content. Conversely, to determine content in terms of itself is an indication of dogmatism, and more often than not a confidence trick. This having been said, nowadays, needless to say, in the speeches and writings of thinkers and authors, forms do appear as purified and purely formal, as striving to become self-sufficient, to supplant content, to take its place, which being translated, means the destruction of content. This active formalization becomes an attack on form itself, which is destroyed by its consequent emptiness. Unless of course it can still be used to present a content outside of itself, which has no relation to the form, but which needs a deceptive language in order to appear as a figure. Let us make a provisional incomplete list of these conflicts. A. Rationalism versus reason, formal rationalism, bourgeois intellectualism, never going beyond. The level of understanding versus living concrete dialectical reason. B. Nationalism, the old, classic, right-wing variety, versus nations and versus its own nation as a living thing, on the march towards democracy and socialism. C. Individualism, the individualism of the bourgeois individual isolated and isolating himself in his private consciousness and his own aloofness, versus the individual. The real individual, active, alive, solving problems, starting with his own. The objectivism, the kind which thinks neutrally and impartially, which endlessly weighs the pros and the cons or jumps from one point of view to another, which takes facts in isolation and information out of context, versus thorough objectivity, where thought is allied with practice to grasp every aspect of a contradictory reality, its complex becoming, its hidden tendencies. E. Aestheticism of pure form, technicality and art, the pursuit of pure style and pure plasticity, completely detached abstraction or formalism versus form, etc. This list of isms could go on and on. We have given enough examples to demonstrate the general present tendency of thought, ideology, and culture in bourgeois society. A. Tendency which is concealed by the technical and technocratic errors adopted by most activities in a specific area, and also by the existence of conflicting aspirations, procedures, and efforts to rediscover or create a content. Surely this general formalism means that human activities and capabilities are being alienated in a multiplicity of ways, heterogeneous and yet drearily monotonous. That while shapes external one to the other and external to living man are being projected, human activities and capabilities are being split apart. It is a general alienation, coming to the surface in the overall structure of society and brought forth by the movement of that structure but constantly turning back towards and into day-to-day living. Might this not give us a potentially vital guide to the critique of everyday life? We began by showing the danger of using the notion of alienation in an abstract, isolated, speculative way. The philosopher has no right to elaborate this notion in itself, to examine it outside actual alienated or alienating situations. He has no right to isolate the domain of philosophy. Once he has established the notion and its universal significance, he must move over into other well-defined areas, political economy, sociology, and above all, he must confront the notion with concrete situations in everyday life. Here, however, basing ourselves upon practice and on the real contemporary situation, we may rediscover generalities, and thus halt the decline of knowledge into the mere observation of facts, into mere empiricism or mere pragmatism. One, this theoretical development does not give us the right to postulate by decision or option activity as essentially human, and another, which we find unpleasant or boring, as dehumanized, alienated, or alienating. The critique of everyday life does not make life's problems any simpler. It requires and determines a critical and self-critical consciousness which is higher than the consciousness exerted when we make the occasional uncomplicated choice. Anyone who wishes to found an ethic and his personal ethic on the notion of alienation needs to have a precise and analytic tool and a consciousness that has been finely honed by the dialectic at his disposal. Only then will he be able to find his way through the labyrinth which is all social life and through the jungle which is bourgeois society. Only then will he distinguish between what is life-enhancing and what is obscurantist and static in his life. Thus everyone may perhaps be able tightly to embrace their own lives and to love them without evading any task, fruitful conflict, or useful risk. In short, we have returned to the level of philosophy, a philosophy tested by life. It is as much a question of ethics as it is of sociology. But before we can broach the ethical problems, we will need to put our concepts to the test, to verify them and develop them more thoroughly, and not just once. The seventh philosophy and the critique of everyday life. Philosophy is going through a very difficult period, and so is the philosopher. He draws comfort from the thought that he is not the only one. One wonders, is it growing? Pains, an adolescent crisis, or a terminal illness? One being first and foremost the philosopher. One of the most curious symptoms of this crisis is philosophy's increasing importance. Who is there who does not long to have his say about important problems? Specialists from the various sciences, men of action, men of state, they all yearn to launch into vast reflections, and by doing so to justify themselves in grandiose terms. This is an outpouring of philosophy in which the philosopher himself disappears, and the more obscure he becomes, the more disturbing he is, assuming always he perseveres in being a philosopher. It becomes easier for him to inspire fear in people. The promotion of philosophy to the status of an ideology of a weapon in the great struggles between classes, nations, peoples, is not without its drawbacks. It is subjected to appalling pedagogic or political simplifications. Over a period of 20 or 30 years, we have been forced to witness the schematization of the dialectic. The Stalinist interpretation has reduced the subtle way of thought first to a robust and popular common sense, and that was the heyday of Stalinist interpretation, the era of anarchism and socialism. Then to the permanent 7-point plan, 4 points for the dialectic, 3 for materialism. With the definition of matter and of consciousness as a reflection of it, philosophy comes to an end. Everyone thinks he is a philosopher and sets off cheerfully for life's fray, armed with his possibly useful but somewhat lightweight equipment. The role of philosophy is over. The general worldwide crisis has certainly not spared non-Marxist philosophy. That was the sector where it began. It has also affected Marxist philosophy. But the symptoms are different. On one side, the non-Marxist side, the symptoms are obscurity, jargon, technicality, illusory profundity. On the Marxist side, they are false clarity, pedagogy which takes itself as a measure of thought, desiccated dogmatism and skeletal schematization, propagandist exploitation of ideological themes. Philosophy is in its death throes. It is being killed off, or perhaps it is the philosopher who is committing some second-rate harakiri. In the period of the last 25 years, have the philosophers in the Soviet Union been blind or merely unwilling to see? Have they been in hiding? What analysis of the real, or what elements for an analysis of the real, have they contributed? What worthwhile books have they produced? Certainly not the glossaries, dictionaries, or encyclopedias in which the formulations have changed only according to the political situation. We cannot even say to their credit that these official or semi-official philosophers use the kind of ruses by which other philosophers, Lukács, for example, but not only him, since the reader may enjoy looking for a few such ruses here in this book, managed to introduce a few new ideas into the general debate. Today, even the most prudent, the most official Marxists admit that a new analysis of this period is needed. Now the aridity of Marxist philosophy, and that in the very countries where it should have grown and developed, cannot be separated from the sum total of the events that have taken place. It is an aspect of the situation, and must be analyzed and studied. Marxists must open their eyes and examine the fact closely. Marxism has become boring. It has been a disappointment. Young people are disappointed with it because it bores them. If the philosopher can no longer be accepted as typifying man, or as the mediator between heaven and earth, between the relative and the absolute, then what role has he to play? If in the last analysis it is the masses which judge, if philosophy becomes accessible and turns into a force, if the political leader speaks, legitimately when like Lenin he has attained authentic and incontrovertible greatness. As a philosopher, what use can the philosopher have? As a funeral director, a pallbearer for the past, in other words, as a historian for out-of-date philosophy. As a second-hand scholar, following painfully in the footsteps of genuine scholars. As a latter-day encyclopedist. As a vulgarizer, compiling glossaries and manuals. None of this is worth even an hour's effort. So the philosopher is beset with self-doubts. He lets himself be outclassed by literary hacks whose bestsellers bring them fame and fortune. He gives in to the temptations of literature or politics, and abandons philosophy, yes. Philosophy too, to platitude and mediocrity. This leads us to the point when we need to ask ourselves what the critique of everyday life means. To confront philosophers with life, simple life, and its problems. To immerse them in this human raw material and to ask their help in mastering it, in scraping away the coating of mud to reveal the gems within. Would that be breakthrough, a new direction? How should we situate the critique of everyday life in relation to classic philosophy? Is there room in Marxist philosophy for a critique of everyday life considered as a philosophical discipline? Are we dealing with a sociological undertaking in the narrow sense of a specialized discipline, or of an undertaking with a philosophical meaning and a set of concrete contents and social objects to support it? It is not enough simply to examine the concept of alienation and its actuality in the dialectical meaning of the word. For here we are talking about philosophy as an activity, and of the philosopher as such of his function, his situation, rather than about philosophy as a set of concepts and as the development of those concepts. As an activity, philosophy used to be precisely one of those exceptional and superior activities through which men who could devote their lives to leisure 93 could step outside of everyday life, and which involved criticism of everyday life, implicitly or explicitly. Among these activities we can also include dreams, the imaginary, art, play, ethics, political life, etc. In terms of these activities, the first definition of everyday life is a negative one. If in our minds, by a sort of abstraction, we remove the highly specialized occupations from man and from the human, what is left? An apparently very scanty residue. In reality, this so-called residue contains a human raw material which holds hidden wealth, as our study shows. The higher activities derive from it, they are at one and the same time its ultimate expression, its direct or indirect critique and its alienated form, albeit an alienation embodying a more, or less conscious and successful attempt to achieve disalienation. Would the aim of a critique be to systematize the various perspectives offered by these higher activities and by the indirect criticisms they imply? Or conversely to exclude them systematically and to separate the exceptional moments from the everyday by way of an apology for the latter? Neither. The second of these objectives would abandon everyday life to vulgarity. It would bring back a sort of populism into philosophy. Thus it would grant art, science, ethics, and philosophy the inordinate privilege of constituting superhuman, and therefore inhuman, worlds. It is therefore an interpretation we must formally reject. On the other hand, the first objective would limit itself to confronting what is possible with what was been accomplished. It would delve into poetry or play or ethics, in search of images from beyond everyday life which could be used in evidence against it. It would add little to works of the past which can be looked upon as indirect criticisms of everyday life. So neither objective is valid, and yet they both are, for we must be careful neither to abandon the acquired or potential wealth of the content of the human raw material, nor to lose whatever was achieved in the highest, most intense moments. The problem is therefore to define the reciprocal relation of these activities and realities, the simple moments and the highest moments of life. Superior, differentiated, and highly specialized activities have never been separate from everyday practice, they have only appeared to be so. Their consciousness of being separate from it was in itself a link. They implied an indirect or implicit criticism of the everyday only inasmuch as they raised themselves above it. Thus French, 18th century philosophy, literature, art, ethics, and politics corresponded to the everyday life of the bourgeoisie, the new pursuit of happiness, pleasure, luxury, profit, and power. In the same way, 18th century rationalism corresponded to the everyday attitude expressed in commonplace books And every time a scientist comes up with a formula or a law, he is of necessity condensing a long experience in which the lowliest assistant and the simplest tool have had their part to play. And yet these appearances, like all appearances, contain certain reality. Specialized activities, considered as activities with their products or works, genuinely did develop outside and above the everyday. Only by controlling it through this externality were they able to condense it, to concentrate its meanings and achievements. There is a cliché which with a certain degree of justification compares creative moments to the mountaintops and everyday time to the plain, or to the marshes. The image the reader will find in this book differs from this generally accepted metaphor. Here everyday life is compared to fertile soil. A landscape without flowers or magnificent woods may be depressing for the passer, but flowers and trees should not make us forget the earth beneath, which has a secret life and a richness of its own. The indirect criticism of the everyday in works of the past which emerged from that everyday appeared only too frequently to devalue it. People who gather flowers and nothing but flowers tend to look upon soil as something dirty. Practical activities were always the basis and the foundation for pure thought and even for its most extreme form, pure contemplation. What does the contemplator contemplate, if not from afar, the everyday, the crowd, the masses, all the things from which his Epoche 94 holds him aloof, and which he will try in vain to rediscover. 95 And yet the situation is eventually reversed. The day dawns when everyday life also emerges as a critique of the superior activities in question, and of what they produce, ideologies. The devaluation of everyday life by ideologies appears as one-sided and partial, in both senses of the word. A direct critique takes the place of indirect criticism, and this direct critique involves a rehabilitation of everyday life, shedding new light on its positive content. We have already demonstrated how the worker as a human being constitutes a whole. To consider him as such means that the separation between the human factor, the technical factor, and private life and in leisure is ruled out, but not as a result of analyzing the and contradictions between the elements which make up the whole. The fragmented character of modern industrial labor both encloses and conceals the social character of all the work done in any one firm and of the total labor. In society, the growing socialization of labor and the relations of production. Thus the worker's consciousness of the social character of labor comes to him largely from outside, rather than from his own individual work, notably from his political life. It is a consciousness which he expects and demands from his own work, which he needs in order to understand that work and the place it holds, and yet it does not come from his work alone. We need to study the life of the worker in its varied aspects, its conflicts, its contradictions. The consciousness of the worker involves together with the content of his own practical experience numerous ideological elements, some justified, others illusory, some atavistic, coming for example from the peasant or artisan classes, others deriving from objective but partly outmoded conditions of capitalism, the free labor contract and competitive capitalism, the classic forms of the class struggle. Still others derive from the new conditions within capitalism, monopolies, and new content contradicting the monopolistic form of capitalism, trade union action and new forms of class struggle, others deriving from socialism. And finally others coming from individual limits or the limits of the group the worker in question belongs to, corporatism, professional solidarity, etc. If we consider the overall life of the worker, we will see that his work and his attitude towards work are linked to social practice as a whole, to his experience as a whole, his leisure activities, his family life, his cultural and political goals, as well as to the class struggle. What is more, this whole must be taken in the context of a specific country and nation, at a specific moment of civilization and social development, and is involving a certain set of needs. And this brings us back to the critique of everyday life. Let us turn to another very precise example, political activity. It can be founded on already established authority, or on constituted law, on mystification and violence, or on knowledge. Insofar as it is founded on knowledge, it requires the most scrupulous attention to everyday life. The progressive or socialist politician must know the life and the needs of the people whose immediate or essential interests he is defending. If he strays from this duty, he is no longer qualified for the task. He is progressive or socialist only insofar as he has this knowledge. The simplest matters concerning housing, roads, children's playgrounds, public transport, etc., have their place in a hierarchy of requirements which may lead to the transformation of the state. The politician's talent rests on his ability to grade the elements in this hierarchy and to address whatever is essential at any given moment. And yet if true politics involves a knowledge of everyday life and a critique of its requirements, conversely everyday life involves a critique of all politics. Political life is by definition lived out in the stratosphere of society, in the sphere of the state and on that level. The problems posed in political life are both abstract and concrete, but they have an aura of technicality which makes them appear totally concrete. Questions of law, finance, budget, etc. However, their abstraction can conceal both the fact that they will influence many human lives and interests, and that any solution proposed will be class-specific. More generally, in the modern state, the citizen, insofar as he is separate from the private man and the productive man, becomes externalized in terms of his own self. He plays a part in a political community in which he sees himself as social, whereas he is also social and more so in another context. The citizen, the man who is well informed about public matters, who has reasoned opinions, who knows the law, has become a political fiction. For there are necessarily political fictions just as there are necessary legal ones. Ignorance is no defense in law. At this point we could define concrete democracy as the reduction of the role of political fictions to a minimum. The externality of the citizen in relation to his own everyday life becomes of necessity projected outside of himself, in models, in fanaticisms, in idealizations, in fetishisms. Wherever it appears, the cult of personality has a political sense, and can never be reduced to a peripheral ideology. It is bound up with the nature of the state. It signifies both a democracy and a lack of democracy, a political fiction which is in danger of becoming a crushing reality. The externality of the citizen and his projection outside of himself in relation to his everyday life is part of that everyday life. The German 96 conception of the modern state, which abstracts from real man, was only possible because and insofar as the modern state itself abstracts from real man or satisfies the whole man in a purely imaginary way. 97 wrote Marx in one of the rare and precious texts in which he talks to us about the total man, and what was valid for the monarchical state, for enlightened despotism, and for Hegel's ethically based state remains valid for any state which establishes itself above society. The man who holds power becomes the only total man, and at the same time embodies the fiction of the total man in the eyes of every individual, its deceptive image. From this analysis Marx drew a decisive conclusion about the state. Only when real, individual man resumes the abstract citizen into himself, and as an individual man has become a species, being in his empirical life. His individual work and his individual relationships, only when man has recognized and organized his forces propers, own forces, as social forces, so that social forces no longer separated from him in the form of political force, only then will human emancipation be completed. 28 Wherever there is a state, it is in the state that individual man will find his generality, his generic existence as a man, and this he does by becoming an imaginary member of a fictitious community. Within every class-based society, the constraints that one class imposes upon another are always a part of the inhuman power which reigns over everything. On that level, the individual sees himself divested of his real individual life and filled with unreal universality. 99 How does the individual see himself when faced with the enormous mass of the state, like a minute speck, like a shadow? He becomes for himself an unreal appearance. But at the same time, by an absolute contradiction, the political fiction sanctions the private man, qua-selfish individual with personal interests, as the supreme reality. This division assigns reality to egoism and abstract form to the citizen. Therefore, political revolution can take place without the state's natural basis. Real social life, the world of needs or of private law, being submitted to a critique and completely transformed. And if the political transformation subsequently revolutionizes certain of these elements, after having dissociated them and thus particularized them as elements, it may leave certain others intact. For example, it might leave the world of needs to one side, or likewise the law, despite having transformed private interests or the way labor is organized. Thus there is alienation by politics wherever the state has not yet withered away, for the Marxist critique of the state attacks all states. If certain texts are specifically directed against the Hegelian state or the bourgeois democratic state, others specify the political state in general, in its relation with civil society. In no respects do the texts quoted by Lenin in The State and Revolution, on the smashing of the bourgeois constitution of a new state and its decline invalidate the earlier texts. Rather, they confirm them as a function of concrete political situations. But if politics alienates and contains alienation, it can also be disalienated. And this through political activity, in and through struggle on the political level, and in and through the conflict between life and politics. Here again we recognize a complex of contradictions within a unity. In a sense, bourgeois democracy and capitalist society, for example, entails a maximum of alienation, total alienation, complete political alienation. It perfects the opposition between the public and The private, between community and slavery, it mystifies every individual by granting him a place both in slavery and in community, in fiction and in reality. It allows him an apparent independence, because he takes the unbridled movement of the spiritual and material elements which form the content of his life 100 for total freedom. The individual becomes totally subservient and totally dehumanized. At this point, the only link between all these social atoms and fragmented activities seems to be the state. It is not irrelevant to point out here that right from the start of his career, Stalin fell foul of what Marx calls political superstition, the illusory idea that the state cements society together, whereas it is the functioning of civil society and its cohesion, even in the apparent anarchy of its activities, which support the state. 101 The individual realizes that in bourgeois society, the way he represents himself for others and for himself is contradictory, in that it splits him in two. On the one hand, it isolates him as private, atomizing him, dividing him, and this is a false image. Atoms have no needs, they are self-sufficient, without needs, contented, perfect. Then on the other hand, the individual realizes that each of his activities, his properties, his impulses involves a need. This need brings him into relationship with other people. No matter how alienated need, natural necessity, and man's essential properties may become, they still form a link between the members of this society. Thus, these needs in everyday life are a cohesive force for social life, even in bourgeois society, and they, not political life, are the real bond. So the individual tends to transcend his own separation from himself, his illusory image, his real appearance and false reality, his artificial atomization, his duplicity. He recognizes himself, and even by recognizing himself as an egoistic individual, he has transcended political superstition. Let us sum up. There is a set of elements to consider, and to the ones we have already examined, we must add this complex contradiction. The citizen, the public man, the member of a state versus the real man, the private man. It is a complex system, for the public man and the citizen are at one and the same time fictitious and real. Insofar as they are real, they pull the reality of man into the fictitious realm. As for the private man, he is also both real and fictitious. Everyday life includes political life. The public consciousness, the consciousness of belonging to a society and a nation, the consciousness of class. It enters into permanent contact with the state and the state apparatus thanks to administration and bureaucracy. But on the other hand, political life detaches itself from everyday life by concentrating itself in privileged moments, elections for example, and by fostering specialized activities. Thus the critique everyday life involves a critique of political life, in that everyday life already contains and constitutes such a critique, in that it is that critique. Let us now consider the structure of consciousness. A man's consciousness is determined by his social being. To coin a phrase, it reflects it. The word reflection can lead to many confusions and above are all too many simplifications. If we are to avoid them, all we need do is notice that in nature reflections profoundly different from what they reflect, and the image in the mirror only appears to be a reproduction of whatever is in front of it. The theory which maintains that on the one hand there are things and on the other there are reflection in men's minds, and that the one reproduces the other, is philosophically puerile. A reflection in a consciousness, or a reflection which constitutes a consciousness, can be incomplete, mutilated, inverted, distorted, mystified. It is a reflection, and yet in the generally accepted sense it is not a reflection. Let us consider the inverted, distorted, mystified. It is a reflection, and yet in the generally accepted sense it is not a reflection. Let us consider the individualist consciousness. Individuals, under classic capitalism, the bourgeois individualist consciousness. In no way does it reflect the social complex to which he belongs. Bourgeois society, capitalism. It is in the very nature of free competition that an overview of phenomena and their laws is beyond the scope of the individual consciousness. And that is why there had to be economists and Marx to discover and understand these laws. The bourgeois, the capitalists, individual consciousness reflects his private interest in competition. It therefore conflicts with society as such, in that it is a social consciousness. The capitalist individual sees the other members of society, be they bourgeois or not, as outside of himself and in opposition to himself. His consciousness only reflects the fact that competition separates one individual from another in such a way as to constitute a society which is beyond the grasp of any individual consciousness. But having said that, we should add that up to a point. The capitalist embodies capital and its functions, and this personification may be more or less successful. The typical bourgeois would be the perfect incarnation of capital, but capital is an economic fetish and cannot in itself define a human being with a human being's consciousness. Every bourgeois is individual sees the other members of society, be they bourgeois or not, as outside of himself and in opposition to himself. His consciousness only reflects the fact that competition separates one individual from another in such a way as to constitute a society which is beyond the grasp of any individual consciousness. But having said that, we should add that up to a point. The capitalist embodies capital and its functions, and this personification may be more or less successful. The typical bourgeois would be the perfect incarnation of capital, but capital is an economic fetish and cannot in itself define a human being with a human being's consciousness. Every bourgeois is joins forces with the need for other people which is determined by the individual is in situation that together they transform needs into desires, decisions, and actions, or conversely, the one inhibits the other. This consciousness is therefore determined by objective conditions, economic, social, but also physiological, etc. However, it is unaware of these conditions. And it is precisely inasmuch as it is unaware of them that it is determined. Such a complex and contradictory situation gives rise to a multitude of problems. The individual, in this case the bourgeois individual, must solve them. He looks for a solution, consciously. He looks to ideologies and moral doctrines for an image of himself. The solutions and possibilities thus revealed and represented through a mixture of ideological fictions and moments of awareness are true or false, illusory or valid. They lead to more or less complete failures or successes, and also to combinations of success and failure. It is possible for the success to have no objective relation with ideology. For example, take a believer who is a successful businessman. He is supported by his faith. He will see his success as a blessing from God, which is how religion is generally perceived in the USA, as a factor in success. Thus activities of an exceptional nature only appear to be beyond everyday life. They are used to solve problems, or not to solve them. The externality of ideology involves a measure of illusions. All this means that the simplified notion of reflection is inadequate as an analytic tool. Consciousness reflects and does not reflect. What it reflects is not what it seems to reflect, but something else, and that is what analysis must disclose. Precisely because the activity that produced ideologies was exceptional and specialized, they came out of social practice, of everyday life, in two senses. It produced them and they escaped from it, thus acquiring in the process an illusory meaning other than their real content. The problem of ideologies is as follows. How can consciousness at all levels, individuals, groups, classes, peoples, be mistaken about itself and its being, when it is content, that very content and that very being which determine it? Only by taking the formal structure of consciousness and its content as inseparables and submitting them to a complex analysis will we be able to understand any particular form of consciousness or any particular ideology. And here we are faced once again with a problem which is fundamental for the critique of everyday life. It is a problem which the first volume of this study failed to pose clearly. Many men, and even people in general, do not know their own lives very well, or know them inadequately. This is one of the themes of the critique of everyday life, confirmed by the spectacular failures of subjectivist sociology, based solely on interviews, questionnaires, or surveys. Men have no knowledge of their own lives. They see them and act them out via ideological themes and ethical values. In particular, they have an inadequate knowledge of their needs and their own fundamental attitudes. They express them badly. They delude themselves about their needs and aspirations except for the most general and the most basic ones. And yet it is there. Lives and their consciousness of life, but only the philosopher and the sociologist informed by the dialectic, and maybe the novelist, manage to join together the lived and the real formal structure and content. Thus ideology is at one and the same time within everyday life and outside of it. It is forever penetrating everyday life, forever springing forth from it, uninterruptedly. Yet at the same time it interprets it, adds to it, transposes it, refracts it, more or less clearly, more or less deceptively. Man's being is at once natural and historical, biological and social, physiological and cultural, which does not exclude possible or real conflicts between these elements and aspects. On the contrary, it involves them. Man thinks because he has a brain, a superior activity of the nervous system, and because he has hands, and because he works, and because he has a language. Therefore consciousness reflects these manifold interactions. It not only reflects the outside world and things, but also human activity, practical power over nature. It not only reflects a given objective environment, but the equally objective conflicts between man and the environment, between the human world and nature, between individuals in the human world. A thing in isolation can only be defined as a product, and consequently as corresponding to a more, or less consolidated power. Even when a consciousness reflects a thing, in truth it is reflecting a power together with the imperatives of action and its possibilities. And this involves a leap forward, the unending escape from what has already been accomplished towards images in the imaginary, towards a realm beyond the everyday, and thence indeed back into the everyday so as to take cognizance of it. And yet it is in everyday life and in everyday life alone that the natural and the biological are humanized, become social, and further that the human, the acquired, the cultivated, become natural. Here there is a constant interaction between the controlled sector, controlled by knowledge and practice, and the uncontrolled sector, unknown, or unbounded by knowledge, so that blind necessity holds sway over man's helplessness and ignorance. It is in everyday life and everyday life alone that those interpenetrations which philosophers and philosophy define in general and abstract terms are concretely realized. Thus when the philosopher turns back towards real life, general concepts which have been worked out by means of a highly specialized activity and abstracted from everyday life are not lost. On the contrary, they take on a new meaning for lived experience. The philosopher discovers that exceptional activities on the benefit from the richness acquired the level of everyday life. Sometimes they contribute to that richness, at other times they prey upon it and suck it dry. They do not produce it. It is in and through everyday life that organs, eyes, genitals are humanized. They have been transformed by history, by work, by social life and culture. This transformation operates in the everyday realm. It flows from the everyday and concludes within it. Otherwise it cannot exist. Here there becomes fundamental appropriation, notion, a philosophical notion which Marx extracted from the work of the economists, and criticized. He then integrated notion and criticism and incorporated them in the theory of capital and property, but without ever fully developing them. Through social practice man appropriates nature, an elementary thesis of Marxism. He also appropriates his own nature. Thus the human eye is no longer the organ with which an animal, nervous or replete, always on the lookout, explores a nature ever filled with danger, ever filled with prey. It becomes the mediator between a consciousness and a formed, welcoming world. By thus becoming a means, it becomes an end. Joy, rest, fulfillment, and communication. Rest simply as an interruption of activity or the opposite of activity, in a fragmented and alienated life, and within a non-dialectical conception of life. In fact, the totality of the conscious being, even while he is resting, even in his exceptional activities, benefits from work itself considered as a total activity. In other words, as the power of man over nature, and his own nature. Material labor, to which intellectual work contributes the essential tools, techniques, concepts, knowledge, creates products. Some of these products are means of production, others are objects or consumer goods. Taken together, products and works make up the human world. But where and in what sphere is the relation between living men and objects of consumption actualized? Where do they become goods in the concrete sense of the term? How are they appropriated? In everyday life, that sphere where needs and goods meet. 102 and yet, where do needs come from? Where are they formed? How? And how do they find what they are looking for? Do needs make up a system? Is there a system of needs or structure of needs? What is the structure? Alongside the scientific study of the relations of production, which is the province of political economy, there is thus a place for a concrete study of appropriation, for a theory of needs. Such a study unfolds philosophical concepts and makes them concrete. In a sense, it renews philosophy by bringing it back into the sphere of real life and the everyday without allowing it to disappear within it. But it also belongs to a specific science which we have called sociology. The social relation between individuals and products and works embodies modalities and various aspects which can be distinguished by analysis. It cannot be reduced to the economic study of the processes of production and circulation, or as vulgar economics has it, distribution. It involves a sociology, and even a psychology. It has ideological, cultural, and even ethical aspects which the economist may glimpse, but which he is unable to grasp. The notions of need and of good affect political economy on the one hand, and ethics, the theory of social classes, the critique of society, and the definition of society, culture, and civilization on the other. Thus they affect concrete philosophy. Therefore we need to develop the notion of need and to formulate a theory of needs. This will be one of the aims of the next volume of this critique of everyday life. Everyday life in a sense residual, defined by what is left over after all distinct, superior, specialized. Structured activities have been singled out by analysis, must be defined as a totality, considered in their specialization and their technicality. Superior activities leave a technical vacuum between one another which is filled up by everyday life. Everyday life is profoundly related to all activities, and encompasses them with all their differences and their conflicts. It is their meeting place, their bond, their common ground. And it is in everyday life that the sum total of relations which make the human and every human being a whole takes its shape and its form. In it are expressed and fulfilled those relations which bring into play the totality of the real, albeit in a certain manner which is always partial and incomplete. Friendship, comradeship, love, the need to communicate, play, etc. The substance of everyday life, human raw material in its simplicity and richness, pierces through all alienation and establishes disalienation. If we take the words human nature dialectically and in their full meaning, we may say that the critique of everyday life studies human nature in its concreteness. So then how are we to define the function of the philosopher? Will philosophy still retain a meaning as a specialized activity? Yes, it will. Once the philosopher is committed to life, he will watch over its meaning and its development from within. He will not set himself up above the everyday, in the sphere of exceptional activities, in the domain of ideologies and of the state. At the very heart of the everyday, he will discover what is hindering or blocking the march forward. He will remain a witness to alienations, and their judge. Keeping his vigil by night and day, the philosopher will not be satisfied simply to study the development of human nature. He will want to help it, negatively at least, but the negative is also positive, by removing whatever may obstruct its fragile seeds. And the more life is in jeopardy, the more vigilant he will be. An overall picture of the universe, a cosmology, an ontology, a theory of knowledge. It is not on such a traditional level that the philosopher will rediscover his lost concrete universality. To rediscover it, he must confront looming alienations as a critic and an implacable enemy, wherever they come from. This duty has its dangers, both for the philosopher as individual and also for the effectiveness of his role, in that it will always run the risk of turning into an aberrant activity and an irrelevant byproduct. The philosopher must accept these risks. The critique of everyday life does not mean exemption from self-criticism. IX plans and program for the future in principle. This present volume was only intended as an introduction to the critique of everyday life. The first draft of the second volume was abandoned for a number of reasons. 103. The second volume was intended to include a methodical study of little magic spells in everyday life. Words, sayings, interjections, familiar gestures, rituals, minor superstitions, archaisms, countless relics of ideologies and customs whose base has disappeared. These detailed observations were to have been the starting point for an analysis of myths and remains of myths in emotional, erotic, and sensual life, and even more generally in images of the cosmos, as well as in the sphere of human relations in general. In literature, including bad literature, melodrama, serials, on the radio, etc. The plan had one serious drawback, the external, and therefore arbitrary way it was systematized. The book ran the risk of becoming a work of philosophy rather than a piece of concrete sociological research. One fine day, once I had become aware of this objection and the risk involved, I realized that I had at my disposal a vast amount of material in which my object of study was concretely embodied. The romantic press, the so-called women's press. In it we find survivals, superstitions, rituals, myths, and modern mythology, formulated and systematized in accordance with new and obscure needs, and that in the fullness of the everyday, in a direct expression of the preoccupations and aspirations of the most immediately practical kind of everyday life. Moreover, this press represents an extraordinary sociological fact, which cries out to be analyzed. It is precisely over the last 10 years that it has achieved its worldwide success and importance. In France, its 3 million copies per week are read by 10 million women, and men. What does this enormous success mean? What new need does it reveal? Is it profound or superficial, valid or spurious? What structure of consciousness does it reveal? What contents? Thus, the second volume of Critique of Everyday Life will include an attempt at a theory of needs which will develop the observations included here and in works of contemporary sociologists, economists, and demographers. B. An analysis of the romantic press, not on the economic level as a commercial organization, but on the sociological level. An analysis of the formal structures of consciousness, of ideologies, and more profoundly of the contents and the needs insofar as one can grasp them through their public expression. C. The outline of an analysis of class relations and attitudes in everyday life, of the contents and needs which these attitudes and conflicts reveal. Obviously, I will not be able to isolate these different chapters. Moreover, the final section on class relations could become the subject of a special volume if it at last became possible to carry out precise, concrete, and broad-based surveys in France. 104. Paris, December 1956 to February 1957. One brief notes on some, well, trodden ground, numbers have lost nothing of their mystical glamour. Between 1880 and 1900s, in a confusion worthy of the panic which greeted the year 1000, most artists and writers considered themselves to be fin de siècle and decadent.